Yo, what's up guys? Hope you guys are doing good. So today we are going to see what if Naruto got harem with Mikasa part 2. Hope you will enjoy this video. So before we start, please like the video and subscribe to our channel and hit bell notification. It motivates me to upload more fanfic for my lovely audience. So let's get started. Nay, Naruto-kun. Hi, Hange-san. Would you transform for me? For the last time. No. He snapped at the brunette that was by all rights, technically his superior. I've had enough poke and prodding for one day, thank you very much. Now let me be. Just once. She continued, all but begging. It's not fair that Levi and Erwin got to see it before me. Yada. Can we please go on ahead now? Kurama begged, his deep voice lanced with a rare touch of fear. I'm not enjoying this. Seriously. Don't you dare leave me alone with her. Sorry boy, you're on your own. Uzumaki Naruto groaned and tried to bury his head further into the folds of his scouting cloak, tried to ignore that familiar voice ringing in his ears. There was only so much fabric, however, and with his height and build he couldn't manage anywhere near as well as he would have liked. Instead he merely urged his horse on ahead, spurring the animal away from the group. That was the problem with the Scouting Legion, he reflected, the problem of being a part of something again. This wasn't like teaching and training his disciples, though he'd rather enjoyed spending those 3 years on Mikasa and the others where he could dictate the pace. Here, surrounded by these men and women of equal skill and titan-killing prowess, the Jinchuriki had to curtail his frustrations, many though they were, and work with them as a team. That was how humanity had survived for the last century, and it was how they intend to continue surviving now. By working together, functioning as one, these seemingly ordinary folks had slain more than a dozen titans. It was one of the reasons Naruto had first thought to join them in the first place. His skills were better served outside the walls, where he didn't risk hurting or killing his comrades by using his full strength. Besides, it was far more exciting out here. Or so he'd thought. That was before they forced him to learn how to use this blasted maneuver gear. Before they forced him to ride a horse instead of letting him run on his own 2 feet as a true shinobi should. Erwin had assured him the indignation would fade in time, and to the rest of the men, it would make it seem that he was willing to make compromises. Unfortunately, Naruto had never much been one for those. His pride burned for every instant that he was forced to ride this horse, a stubborn mare that simply refused to move at the speed its master wished. It irked him to no end that he couldn't just run on ahead of them on foot and slaughter the enemy. That he was forced to ride an animal, a beast of burden no less regulated to move at their pace when every fiber of his being screamed for action and activity, irked him, to say the least. As did the fact that he could no longer wander outside the walls at his own discretion. But time and time again he had to remind himself that he needed to conserve his stamina, mighty and everlasting though it might be, and at least keep up the appearances that he was human. His transformation 3 years ago had given the denizens of Walrose quite the shock. He had heard that there'd even been some deaths, quite a few heart attacks had been reported that day. Come on, don't be like that. Not again. Naruto nearly slammed his head into the back of his horse as Hanji rose up beside him, her steed easily matching his stride for stride. Hanji Zoe. A veteran of the Survey Coppers and admittedly quite the looker when you got past her fascination for all things Titan and authorize. No one knew had laid eyes upon his Titan transformation save Erwin and Levi, but unfortunately for them Hanji had been quite dogged in her persistence. When confronted with the knowledge that humanity's sole Titan shifter shows how much they knew, was riding right beside her, the woman simply hadn't been able to help herself. Why, Kami? Why oh why, was it his fate to be surrounded by weirdos? I'm begging you here, she pleaded. Pretty please. Hanji, I will eat you. Ooh, scary. A sly grin crept across her visage. Is that a promise? I'm not kidding, Bakayaru. It's no use trying to dissuade her. Levi chided beside him. She has every right to be excited about this. Just as I do. You're excited. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Well, he certainly didn't look it. In fact, if one were to glance at Levi, they wouldn't have thought much of him at all. Short, with straight black hair, sharp eyes and an almost perpetually disinterested expression caused him to look as though he wasn't interested in anything or downright apathetic, despite the contrary. He almost reminded Naruto of a mini Sasuke, though he'd never have said that aloud. Still, just the thought of it made him smile. The shorter man met Naruto's smile with a deadpan of his own. Oi oi, what are you smirking for? Nothing. No reason. There was a prolonged silence as the three of them rode alongside one another, the countryside blurring by. So, ha-ng. Eep. Laughter arose from the rest of the riders, and for a moment the blonde couldn't help but wonder, was all this an act on her part? Was Hanji deliberately messing with him just so he'd show some emotion? To get them to lower their defenses and welcome him as one of their own? Hanji's enthusiasm is commendable, Erwin reminded, his voice carrying on from the head of their formations. Levi and myself aside, we've yet to see what you're capable of firsthand. This is, after all, your first official outing with the Legion. Whereas Levi's appearance contrasted his demeanor, their commander was the exact opposite. Stoic and stern with short-cropped blonde hair and gray eyes, he radiated a no-nonsense aura, one of command and cold logic. Your skills and battle prowess might be the tipping point we need in regaining Wall Maria. If Levi vouches for your skills, then I trust you implicitly. Damn. Naruto and Kurama shared the same thought. The shinobi's grin was positively beatific. He'd known the commander was blunt, but damn. Way to flatter him. Well, when you put it that way, don't be too surprised if I wipe out all the titans by myself. He grinned. For all his earlier woes, it felt good to be a part of something again. Then Hanji started pestering him about the transformation again, and his glee faded. He was so busy smacking her over the head he didn't even notice it when Levi rode ahead of him to join Erwin. Indeed, he never gave the matter a second thought. Are you sure it's alright to pump him up like that? It helps if he's motivated. Erwin replied, never once glancing back at the whiskered warrior. Today's exercise will cement everyone's faith in him. If all goes well, we should be able to successfully retake Wall Maria in a month from now. What's important now at this moment is camaraderie. The others won't be willing to throw their lives away for someone they don't trust. Besides, it's better to have him out here in the field than back in the walls surrounded by those cultists. Levi bit back a grimace at that remark, because as always, Erwin had spoken nothing but the truth. The wall cult hated Naruto with a passion. To them he was an affront to their three holy walls. A devilish demon who would bring only disaster and despair. They didn't care if he claimed to be on their side or not, they just wanted him dead. His unexpected kitsune transformation hadn't made him any friends 3 years ago, and were his Titan form to ever come to light in the public eye, he'd probably be even worse off than before. And then there was the matter of the military police, sheesh. The more he thought about it, the more Levi realized just how many enemies Naruto had made for himself. What was to stop him from becoming fed up with everything and leaving it all behind? Those so-called he kept on about. His shinobi. The ones he'd spent the last 3 years training. No, Erwin was right. They couldn't afford to lose him. Humanity couldn't afford to lose him. You're a manipulative bastard, you know that. He shook his head at last, risking a glance back at Naruto. Although I can't say I disagree with you. Titans. When the cry went up from Petra a split second before the forest erupted to the south, spilling out a swarm of the beasts, pounding in their direction. For a moment, just a moment, the entire Survey Corps froze. There were so many. Too many. Dozens. Maybe even more. Erwin knew at once what the men and women of his legion were thinking. Where the devil had they been hiding all this time? But now was not the time to hesitate in the face of this newfound adversity. Now was the time for action. Make for the trees. Erwin commanded, knowing at once that even with their 3D maneuver gear the group stood little to no chance on flat terrain. Naruto didn't listen. Even as he thought to issue the same command to the blonde, he was already standing atop his horse, a savage grin ripping across his whisk-eared face. He made no move to make use of his maneuver gear not even when more than half the horde broke off from their pursuit of Levi's group and raced towards him. Something was swirling there in the palm of his hand, something that looked remarkably like a large throwing star of sorts. With that same smile still fixed firmly in place, the blonde cocked his arm back as though he'd been preparing to throw it all along. Erwin, Levi, and the rest of the Recon Corps had just enough time to realize what the blonde intended before he flung it forward. It split the air in twine as it rocketed forward, taking the heads of several titans before imploding and incapacitating dozens more. Naruto leapt after it on foot, surging forward with a speed Erwin was hard-pressed to believe. So this was why he'd wanted to run. He was far faster than their horses. But why was he charging directly at the Titans? He must have had some plan, else he wouldn't have. Exclamation mark. All units, halt. Erwin ordered, realizing exactly what the blonde intended, what he was about to unleash. Even from here, he could see Naruto thrusting a thumb within his mouth. Within seconds, he'd doubtlessly bite on that digit, and when he did, here it comes. Hanji's squeal overrode his thoughts. An errant glance confirmed the woman was wide-eyed and grinning, practically drooling at the thought of what was to come. The transformation. Seconds later, the clearing erupted in a thunderbolt. Bolts of golden and crimson light lanced through the clearing in a blinding brilliance that left everyone reeling, flinging their arms before their faces to ward against this sudden explosion of otherworldly power. All there remained of Naruto was a smoking crater, obscured by a burning haze of steam. There he goes again, Levi murmured, spurring his steed to a halt beside Erwin's. Did he have to transform already? Would you rather he turn into that giant fox and risk crushing us all underfoot? Erwin arched an eyebrow. TCH, his second-in-command scoffed, but said no more. It was true that his kitsune form was far more efficient, but if they went anywhere near the conflict, then they risked being trod to pieces. For a moment, nothing happened. Nothing stirred in that pit of sizzling steam. Nothing moved. Hanji leaned forward eagerly against her saddle, her gaze greedily devouring the distance between her and the crater and the monstrosity that was bound to emerge from within. She could barely contain her anticipation. The moment Naruto would emerge. Would it be a 7-meter titan? Maybe a 15-meter? Would it resemble Naruto at all? Or would it deform even his most masculine features? Oh, she couldn't wait. When was he going to? ROOOOOOOOAAAARGH. As if to defy her every expectations, a massive titan towering 20 meters tall, easily the size of a large building, came bounding out of the smoke, roaring its head off. Its legs lopped forward in long, earth-consuming strides, carrying it towards its downed fellows at an almost ruthless pace. Hanji's jaw nearly fell clear off her face. Sue. Here she goes again. Gunther groaned, bracing himself for the outburst that was slowly building inside their buntecho. Sugoi. Her scream threatened to overpower their ears, nearly deafening the entire squad on the spot. Look at him. He's huge. Massive. Big. Indeed. Although he'd seen this behemoth once before, Erwin's eyes still bucked at the sight of it. Its body was entirely unlike any titan he'd ever seen, and he had seen many in his time. Vaguely humanoid it was, in that it stood up on 2 legs. That was where the resemblance ended. Instead of the standard type, this monstrosity bore not 2, not 4, but 6 arms, 3 to each side. Shaggy blonde hair obscured blazing red orbs and a whiskered face, dropping past his ears and shoulders, framing a mouth full of knife-like teeth that would make even the most hardened soldier shiver. It's gigantic, Petra whispered, awed by the sheer size of the creature bounding away from them, its armored arms swinging a mile a minute. Naruto's titan form put on a sudden burst of speed. Cannoning forward into its fellow titans with a roar, fists swinging. Caught unawares, they never stood a chance. 6 arms lashed onto arm and limb and all manner of bodily parts, tearing them free in great gouts of gore. All those hands did was destroy, grabbing and tearing and pulling and wrenching with terrible speed and precision. It was as if they had become blades, 6 separate swords that sliced and slashed and severed whatever they touched. Naruto felt them crunch beneath those mighty fists like beetles popping under a boot. Their bodies broke like shells and the softness within was ground to gory smears on the ground below. And, throughout it all, not a single drop of blood spattered upon him. Any moisture that dared near this gleaming demon of death simply evaporated on the spot. He was death incarnate, come to wreak havoc and destruction, come to destroy the fools that dared stand against him, come to deliver his own brutal brand of justice. Even the largest of titans didn't stand a chance against him, he simply overpowered them. The steam poured from his every orifice, it sang power and hatred and strength. This is death, this is retribution, and I love it. Don't lose yourself. Kurama cautioned. Relax. Naruto replied as he effortlessly crushed a titan's skull with one hand and bit the head of another. I've had all of 3 years to master this form. It's like a second skin to me now. Although I still prefer our Biju form. Still, there was a certain exhilaration to be found fighting in this body. 3 years ago, he loathed it. He couldn't use any of his ninjutsu or senjutsu in this form and was limited to use his armored arms and strength to eradicating the enemy. His anger had come from his inexperience in this form. But with experience had come strength, and with strength, confidence. Now, when he fought in this great form, he simply felt free. He wondered if Annie felt the same. He'd never seen her in her Titan form before, so he had no way of knowing what she looked like when she did change. On your right. Naruto dropped down to his haunches just before a 16-meter type sailed over his head, its spindly arms still outstretched in a failed attempt to grab him. An errant thought caused the extra arms mounted atop his shoulders to twist around backwards, rising to greet this new threat. They grabbed hold of either end of the Titan and pulled, tearing it asunder like so much tissue paper. The severed halves dropped to the earth amidst the swarming Titan's upper half twitching, still struggling to rise as the blonde's foot descended upon their neck. One stomp later and the Titan's corpse joined the others in a swiftly growing pile at his feet. He lost himself in battle after that, his body moving purely on instinct, crushing anything that came near, his mind no longer processing the time or techniques it took to end the Titans in artful fashion. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't enjoying this. It was the closest thing he felt to a physical high, every fiber of his being rejoiced in the ugly slaughter taking place around him, glorying in the carnage that he'd created. Alas, all good things have to end. It took him less than 3 minutes to kill 25 Titans. Funny. It seemed like so much longer. As he crushed the nape of his final opponent, he glanced around and realized the clearing was finally devoid of those disgusting aberrants that had come from out of nowhere. Such a shame. Nothing save a swarm of Titan numbering in the hundreds had any chance of stopping him in this form. He had just enough time to catch back his breath, then he loped towards them in slow strides, eerily aware that just about everyone save Erwin and Levi had their hand on a sword. Well, that was to be expected. Calm down, Levi cautioned everyone. He's not going to attack. But sir, just calm down, their squad leader repeated. Naruto's Titan form gazed at them for what felt like a small eternity. Then he sat down, sending the earth shuddering beneath him. The motion was so sudden and unexpected that all but most experienced members of the Scouting Legion drew backwards. Even Hanji flinched aside at the sudden motion, her eyes slightly wide as the Titan simply sat there, contemplating them. Its jaws and mouth appeared to be moving, creaking open and shut as it struggled to form words, and spoke. Yo! Naruto's voice, an octave lower than normal, issued forth from the Titan's mouth. Pretty sure that makes my kill count 25 now. Silence reigned supreme, across the plains. Of the entire Scouting Legion, none save Erwin and Levi could believe their eyes. This was a trick, right? Surely their eyes had to be playing tricks on them. They had to be. It didn't make sense otherwise. There was just no way that this Titan, this demon of death and destruction, once so fiercely and furious, could possibly be so calm. And yet he was. Naruto sat there like the Buddha himself, smiling back at them, his crimson eyes placid and cool, with not so much as a hint of rage. He can really control it. Petra murmured, awed by the display. Oi oi, Oroo said in disbelief, you gotta be shitting me. Erd simply shook his head. This is the power he possesses. Erwin felt a supreme sense of satisfaction as he folded both arms before his chest. Naruto had single-handedly done in his Titan form what would have taken even Squad Levi at least a few minutes to do. Decimated more than 24 Titans on his own, without any assistance. And now he was speaking to them through his Titan form, displaying almost flawless control. This was it. Right here. This was the key to taking back their lives and land, sitting there on the grass before them. With the powers this man possessed, and those that he'd been training, they might just stand a chance. Those members of the Recon Corps who remained gathered were likewise experiencing different states of disbelief. Hanji shared none of that disbelief. Naruto. Everyone jumped. Can I touch one of those arms? She begged. It's okay, right. Just let me touch it. Hey. Naruto looked to Erwin for confirmation, the latter merely shrugged. Ah, what the hell? Go ahead. Yada. No sooner had the words left her lips than the squad captain bounded forward, wrapping both hands around a single finger. They're big, she observed, noting the calluses upon that lone digit. Really big. Unbelievably big. Nay, how does it feel to be inside that titan's body? Does it feel hot? Are you burning up right now? I really want to know. This bitch is crazy. Kurama hissed inside Naruto's mind. Remind me never to come out when she's around. Is the mighty Kurama afraid of a single human? Yes, very much so. Naruto laughed at that and his titan form laughed with him. Nah, he chortled softly, flexing his fingers. It doesn't burn. Feels kinda cold, actually. Can you pick me up? Naruto's facepalm sent the earth shaking. Are you fucking crazy? You'd better do it, Levi sighed. She'll never stop pestering you otherwise. The things I do for women. Slowly, gingerly, Naruto opened one of his many hands and waited for the squad leader to crawl into it. Then, when he was certain that she was secure, he slowly began to raise his palm. Even to his large ears, Hanji's squeal was practically deafening. Aha! Her goggled gaze darted this way and that, hazel eyes eagerly observing every inch of his whiskered visage. You're even more impressive up close. I could just kiss you. Squad leader, that's dangerous. One of their men cried. He might eat you. Don't tempt me. Naruto growled softly, but his words lacked rancor. Oh, I would never. Hanji practically purred, reaching up to rub at his giant cheek. You might act gruff all the time, but you're really a big softied. Gay. She didn't know it, but she'd hit the nail on the head there. He really wasn't trying to distance himself from others. Naruto really didn't. He simply didn't want to risk harming anyone with these incredible powers of his. There was a reason for all these weights and limiters he made himself wear now. Without them, he ran the risk of truly hurting someone with something so casual as a slap on the back. You've seriously got a thing for titans, Doncha. He drawled back. Yup. Hanji's smile practically outshone the sun. Deep within the titan, Naruto actually flushed. Alright, playtime's over. Somebody wanna get me outta here before Miss Mad Scientist tries to dissect me or something. He grunted in baritone, one of his 6 arms rising to indicate the plated fold in his neck, the remaining 5 twitching slightly from the odd motion. I'd try it on my own, but it's a bitch and takes 5 minutes to do by myself. I'll help. Petra volunteered before Hanji could, snaring his shoulder with a wire and whisking herself up to meet him. She felt she owed him that much for doubting the boy's skill. Be careful, Petra, Orua warned as she neared the blonde's hulking form. We don't know if he's serious or not. Police, came Naruto's booming reply, as if I'd heard a lady. Petra sincerely hoped that was true, that this wasn't all just some act to get them to lower their guard so he could slaughter them. It would be child's play for him to reach up and crush her right now, out here, in open air, with nothing to hook her maneuver gear into. She was easy prey. Gingerly she clambered onto the rock-hard muscle of his shoulder, steadying herself with both arms. His titan form really was absolutely massive. This close, she felt like speck of dust compared to him. I'm in the neck, he grunted as she ascended. Careful not to break your blades, there's some armor up here. Some armor was an understatement. The back of his neck was protected by thick plating, nothing short of a titan's tooth could hope to shatter it directly. No wonder Naruto couldn't emerge on his own. But if one were to place their blade into the grooves between the flesh and bone. Unthinking, Petra sank her blade into the flesh of his neck and began to pry at it. Only to be stopped seconds later by a furious hiss. Fook. A pained growl came from beneath the wall of thick flesh. That was my arm. Sorry. Just be glad I can regenerate. I've almost got it, Petra replied, splitting the groove with her blade, forcing it upwards with all of her strength. And I'm out. Naruto burst out of the back of the neck in a burst of gore, his body still steaming from the motion. Finally, I was starting to suffocate, in there. Unfortunately, he'd made one miscalculation. So had Petra. She hadn't expected him to emerge that swiftly once she'd cut him free, and he hadn't expected her to still be standing there. The result. Collision. They fell from the Titan's shoulder in a tangle of arms and legs, much to the amusement and disbelief of the Survey Corps, crashing to the ground in pained heap. Well, this isn't awkward at all. Naruto observed as she lay atop him. We barely know each other, Petra. Petra jerked back as if she'd been burned, nay, her face was flushing 6 different shades of scarlet. WWW, what are you saying, Naruto Dono? Ah, you're the impressionable sort, it seems. Kia. Everyone laughed at her reaction, not to slap the blonde silly, but to leap off him and bolt in the opposite direction. Even from. Oi, that was way too fast. Hanji complained, squirming about as the Titan's body began to dissolve, its owner picking himself up off the floor and walking away. I wanted to do some more tests. Use the bones or something. Naruto snapped back. I don't care what you. That was when he felt it, a light tingle, as though a thought somewhere in the back of his mind were pulling at him, tugging for his attention. Naruto slowed, taking his thumb out of his mouth. He turned, facing back in the direction from whence they'd first come, features pinched in concentration as he tried to sense what it was that had called to him. It was a Hiraishin kunai. He'd managed to craft nearly 24 of them during his short-lived time here, 7 of which he'd given away, 1 for each of his disciples. Those 7 were his finest made, he could use them to traverse miles in an instant. All he had to do was open the link in his mind in an eye blink and he'd be transported to that kunai's rough location. But why was he being called now? He'd given them explicit instructions not to call upon him unless they were in dire straits or if the walls were ever breached. Osanuvabich. Naruto must have cursed aloud because in the next instant everyone was looking at him. What's wrong, Naruto? Erwin readied the anxiety on his face like a book. The walls. He had just enough time to warn. And in a crackle of golden light he was gone. Meanwhile, in Wall Rose. Death had finally come for Mina Carolina. This was it then, she was going to die. She could smell the warm, fetid breath of the Titan, feel it on her face, swarming around her as she fell. Her hand scrabbled for purchase against the slick walls of its throat, but to no avail, she was falling, plummeting down its gullet to her doom. Helpless to do anything but slide down its throat, it was then that Mina Carolina knew her end was nigh. How was this happening? A foolish question. A stupid inquiry, the answer to which she already knew. She had been there with Eren and the others atop the wall. She had seen the colossal Titan, witnessed its destruction firsthand. Been forced to watch helpless, as it laid waste to the cannons kicked in the wall and let the Titans in. She hadn't been able to do anything. All of those techniques Naruto had taught her, useless. She'd been far too afraid, too frightened to do anything. It had been 3 years since she'd trained, nearly 5 in total since the great catastrophe of Wall Maria. And now it was happening all over again. After that abnormal had eaten Thomas, everyone had just panicked. The Titan had snapped her wire, sending her body hurtling into the side of a building. Dazed, she had tried to draw the kunai Naruto had given her, but she'd lost it somewhere during the chaos, her fingers only just brushing its hilt. At this moment Mina wished for more than anything to see her sensei again. But Naruto wasn't here. His duties with the Scouting Legion had practically removed him from her life in the last month. More and more he was becoming feared by the populace for his strange techniques, and even stranger transformations. If he didn't have the support of someone in the monarchy, he'd probably be dead already by now. Or worse, thrust back outside, left to fend for himself. That was why I wanted to join the Legion. Not that it mattered anymore. They were all going to die, and so was she. Naruto's training had been for naught. No one could save her now. There was just no possible way. Mina. Her eyes drifted open. Mina Carolina. Abruptly, they widened. Why am I thinking about that now? Flashback. They stood there before the torches, faced by the man responsible for their own private hell for the last 3 years. It was to be the night of their graduation, not just as soldiers but as shinobi. Mina had never been so happy in all of her life. And yet at the same time, she was sad. This would be their last evening with Naruto. Tomorrow he would officially resume his duties as a member of the Scouting Legion. There would be no more training. Clearing his throat, the whiskered blonde began to speak. Mina Carolina, Mikasa Ackerman, Sasha Brous, Jean Kirkstein, Krista Reese, Annie Leonhardt, Armin Arlett. I am proud of each of you. Naruto's eyes glimmered with pride as he read off the list of names into the moonlight. 7 names. Armin Arlett was one of them. Mina had felt bad for him. He had a brilliant mind, but at the same time lacked a strong body to properly use it. Her father had always reproached her for this weakness. She was simply too kind of a person. As a child, she couldn't stand seeing people suffer. Her empathy had only grown with age, yet another. That same empathy had stirred when she saw Armin, how despondent he'd looked as Naruto passed him by. The very next day she'd all but begged her new sensei to activate the boy's chakra coils as he'd done her own. And Naruto had. To great success. Like Mina, Armin had nearly lost his life countless times over the course of the last 3 years. There had been times when she was almost certain he'd drop out. But the boy had persevered, and as he stood here beside her now tall and proud, Mina Carolina knew at once that she had made a friend for life. You have far exceeded my expectations. Naruto continued, jerking her back to the present with a loud hiss. Not just as soldiers, but as individuals. And as such, I will present to each of you a gift for exceeding. Mina blinked, baffled as their instructor revealed a line of tri-pronged kunai from his coat and began preparing it to each of them in turn. It can only be used once, so take care when holding it. A slight smile broke through his fierce facade, rendering his next words soft and kind. I know it sounds corny, but think of me when you need me most, and so long as you've touched that kunai, I'll be there. Consider it a one-time freebie. Because, from this day on, I am no longer your teacher. We're equals. Brothers and sisters in arms. From this day forth. Just like that, he raised his voice again, his shout carrying over the 7 cadets. The 7 of you are shinobi. End flashback. That's right. Mina thought to herself as she slid still further down the Titan's throat. I'm not just a soldier. I'm not just a shinobi, either. I'm Naruto's disciple. And, I'm not going to die here. Her hands and feet stabbed into the lining of the Titan's throat, no longer seeking a handhold. Mina simply thrust out her arms and legs and released all of her chakra in one monumental burst. Raw power bled from her broken fingertips and booted, grinding her rapid fall to a sudden halt, buying her precious time. Her mind raced for an answer, a million different thoughts racing through her head. Naruto had taught her a handful of his jutsu, her affinity being that of water, but she needed both hands for those, and was hardly adept in either of them. This far back the beast couldn't grab her, but it was taking all of her chakra just to remain rooted in place. And already she could feel her strength sapping, slipping. No, she hissed as she began to slide, slipping 1 inch, then another down its throat. Mina had just begun to scream, to damn herself for her powerlessness, when she heard it, a familiar roar peaking in her ears. Gradually it dissolved from a meaningless animal bleat to sound, someone screaming out at her, swearing a blue streak, spitting curse after endless curse. And over those curses, she heard a single familiar phrase being repeated over and over and over. No you fucking didn't. Her would-be killer must have heard it too. Because the Titan blinked once, its massive head turning a fraction of an inch, prolonging her life for just a sliver of a second. That was all it took. A golden white blur streaked across Mina's vision, interposing itself firmly between her and the Titan's gaping maw, lunging into that black abyss to pull her back from the brink of oblivion. A hand locked around her wrist, squeezing with enough force to fracture the bone. Mina found herself staring up at a familiar whiskered face and blazing blue eyes, the words drying up in her throat as she recognized that shock of blonde hair and the unmistakable scent of warm bread. This was Aura. His hand shot forth like a pulley even as Titan's teeth snapped shut around them. Blood spurted into the air. But it wasn't Mina's blood. It was his. Her savior stood firm and strong, one hand propping open the Kyojin's mouth even as a booted foot arrested its lower jaw from moving any further. Try as it might, the giant couldn't get its mouth to shut, its tongue wriggled restlessly as the man held its mouth open. A strong arm folded itself around Mina's waist and drew her up out of the dark, hauling her to safety. She could only gasp as they flung her out of the beast's mouth and into open air. Her back greeted the outer wall with a dull thud. See, he began slowly, this is why I hate you Titans. You're ugly, stupid, cruel, brutish. I could tolerate that. But this time, you assholes touched my precious disciples. His remaining palm raised itself up in silent offering, fingers clenched into a claw clutched around spiraling sphere. Mina recognized it at once, because Naruto had taught her the very same technique. Rasengan. The Titan began to react to him, to this sudden and more immediate threat, reaching a giant paw up at its mouth. Too little too late, Mina realized. Naruto struck forward with all his might, obliterating the Titan's hand with a single swing of the arm before bringing his arm back up towards its head. That was when its mouth snapped shut on him. Mina's last sight was that of her sensei's startled expression before the beast swallowed with a great gulp, sending the blonde plummeting down its gullet. No. Mina sat there on her knees, unable to believe her eyes. Naruto, was gone. He'd leapt straight into the monster's maw to save her, and now he was gone. Damned to death. No. And she had been the one responsible for it. No. Something snapped deep inside of her. In that instant, Mina Carolina forgot all about what she'd been taught by Naruto. All those jutsu tactics and training were thrown to the wayside. There was only a burning red haze and a desire for vengeance. Vengeance. She'd idolized Naruto, seen him as a true soldier, and now he was gone. I never told him how I felt. She had never told him that her feelings ran deeper than those of a master-student bond. She'd secretly fallen in love with him sometime during the last 3 years. She'd kept quiet about it, had planned on telling him tomorrow when he returned from his expedition beyond the walls. But that would never happen now. He was gone. And it was all her fault. A raw scream ripped from her lips, a mournful cry of love lost, garnering the Titan's attention. It reached for her with its remaining hand and her sword lashed out like lightning. Its narrow edge carving a canyon in the beast's palm, severing its index fingers and thumb. She darted past it, hurtling between its legs and out the other side. It bent down to look at her between those legs, and that was when Mina saw it. An opening. Her body was in the air almost before she realized it, her maneuver gear carrying her unfalteringly toward its neck, her blades swinging down upon its lone vulnerable area in a vicious and violent arc. Mina screamed at the Titan as she struck, expelling all her pent-up feelings in one monumental burst of energy. Die, you bastard! Her sword cut deep and true, almost slicing the neck off in its entirety. Blood spattered across her face, but she couldn't have cared less. This was it. Her first kill. She'd avenged Naruto-sensei. The Titan stood there for a long moment, eyes wide and disbelieving, as though it couldn't believe that it had actually been slain by a rookie like her. And then it began to fall, pitching backwards to land on its back. Mina dropped down after it, her dark eyes leering angrily at the Titan's still form, fighting back furious tears. Now that she'd avenged Naruto, the anger was gone, all that remained was sorrowed resolve. She would not let his sacrifice go to waste. Thank you for saving me, sensei, she whispered. I promise I won't let you down. And she wouldn't. She would slaughter every single Titan. As if in answerment, a deep rumble arose from the Tyrant's gut, prompting Mina to risk a second glance back at the belly of the beast. Was it still alive? No, that was impossible. She'd given it a clean cut across the nape of its neck, so what was happening with its stomach? Another rumble reverberated from the creature's belly, causing its corpse to convulse. It sounded almost like something was shrieking inside of it, growing louder in each passing second. Rasenshuriken. A body erupted out of the Titan's stomach in an explosion of gore, blade in hand. Mina froze. She could see the current of wind swirling in his palm, spitting, sparking as the jutsu extinguished itself. His feet had barely touched the ground before she recognized him. Although his hair was slicked with slime and his body greased with gore, there was no way she could have mistaken him for someone else. Those blazing blue eyes, roaring high with the flame of defiance, the wings of freedom emblazoned proudly upon his great green cloak. Naruto-sensei. She cannoned into him without a second thought, her arms locking around his waist and holding tight. He was alive. He was covered in gore and stank something fierce, but he was alive. And, wait, something was not quite right. She felt as though she should be holding more of him than she was, her arms wrapped around both of his. And yet she felt only one. The IOU one, Mina. He touched a hand to the lone kunai still dangling around her neck. If it weren't for you, I'd never have made it back here in time. Mina felt the tears well up in her eyes, this time she was powerless to stop them. Naruto noticed. Hey, don't cry now. You did well, Naruto, but, the blonde blinked. Your arm. Indeed, Uzumaki Naruto had lost his left limb. All that remained below the shoulder was a ragged stump, dripping droplets of blood. It was gone. Forever. He gave the stump a precursory glance as though only noticing it now for the first time. Mina tensed, expecting an outburst for her concern. Instead, her sensei smiled. It isn't worth much. Naruto soothed, stroking her hair with his hand. Besides, it's just one arm. I'm glad you're safe, though. I could hear everything from inside the Titan's stomach. That was your first kill, wasn't it? Great job. A pained grin pulled at his whiskered cheeks, draw up in a smile that sent her heart fluttering. I'm proud of you, Mina. Sensei. Mina started to cry then, all her pent-up feelings leaking through her eyes and down her cheeks. Naruto said nothing to this, he simply tucked her head into his chest with his remaining arm and held her, allowing her to bury her head in his cloak for what felt like an eternity. Nay, sensei. I want to tell you something. Naruto didn't reply, he merely looked at her, as though awaiting the question. In the end, she couldn't say it after all. And no, never mind, it can wait. Armin Arlert heard the sound of footsteps drawing nearer. But he daren't move. He heard voices calling for him, saying name, and even then, he did nothing. Said nothing. Eren would have done something. Said something to reassure them. But Eren wasn't here. Not anymore. He was gone. Dead. Devoured by the Titan. It should have been me. He should have been the one to die. Not Eren. A useless burden like him could do anything, and he had just gotten all of his friends killed. Min. I'm worthless. I want to die. Armin. Eventually he became aware of movement on his right, in his peripherals. That someone was shaking him now, their hands wrapping around his shoulders. Armin. Snap out of it! Exclamation mark. Gradually his vision resolved into blurs, then shadows, then finally a figure. He caught sight of a familiar button nose set in a pale face and dark, empathetic eyes, her visage framed by dark ebony tresses. At first Armin thought it was Mikasa. But no, Mikasa didn't have long hair anymore. This one did. She was shaking him roughly now, pleading for an answer. Mina. He almost didn't recognize her with her hair down. Wait, Mina never ever wore her hair down. He must be dreaming then. This was all a dream, that must be it. Armin. Slap. A painful open hand smack across his face rocked him back to painful reality. He blinked back the stinging tears, his vision finally resolving into a meaningful image. He found himself staring back at a bedraggled face, a body that looked as though it had just taken a bath in gore and blood. But even so, despite her disparaged state, he didn't fail to recognize her. Mina Carolina. Mina, you're alive. But he'd seen her get eaten. His friend opened her mouth to reply, but someone else beat her to it. Of course she is. Armin stiffened at the sound of a familiarly gruff voice. And so are you, lad. Did you really think I would let any harm come to my precious disciples? The boy started at the reminder, surprised to find Naruto standing tall there behind him, his whiskered visage set in the slithest of scowls. He was covered in blood and slime and his right arm was missing, but he was still very much alive. He'd never been more happy to see him in all his life. If there is anyone who could drive the Titans out of the walls, then it was definitely. Wait. Sensei, your arm. Oh, this. Naruto glanced at the severed stump of his shoulder, still trickling blood. Like I told Mina, it's just one arm. Nothing serious. Besides. With a grunt the inexplicable occurred, a fresh limb sprouted from the detritus of his ruined arm. Naruto stared at his sleeveless limb for a long moment, flexing his fingers. Armin didn't even bother to question it, neither did Mina. They'd seen their fair share of oddities and ends from their teacher in these last 3 years, the growth of a new limb didn't shock them anywhere near as much as it should have. Naruto, was this man really only human as he'd claimed to be? Armin didn't think so. More and more he was beginning to think of his master as some kind of monster. That was not to say he feared him, however. Oh, no. This was one monster he would gladly welcome at any time. Just having Naruto in the immediate vicinity was enough to bolster his confidence, to make him want to stand up and fight again. Where's the rest of your squad? Naruto turned his head, searchingly. There should have been 4 more of you. Armin saw Mina pale out of the corner of his eye, doubtless she was experiencing the horror of watching of everyone get slaughtered again. Drat, he'd started thinking about it again. Just like that, it all came rushing back. The deaths. Thomas. Eren. All the others. Eren. What about Eren? Naruto frowned. Has that crazy bastard killed any Titans yet? No. Then where the hell is he? His sensei demanded. Out with it, boy. He was eaten, sir. Eaten. For a heartbeat, Naruto's face blanked, his eyes draining of all emotion. Then they drifted shut, his lids dusting with orange seconds later. Armin's excellent mind recalled it as Sage Mode. Supposedly it gave Naruto fine-tuned sensory abilities, including the sensing of life. He'd yet to teach it to any of them, citing its many risks, but even so, Armin wondered what his fellow blonde was attempting. Was he trying to track down that titan so he could slaughter it? He'd taught him how to fight after all, so it would make sense if he. Well, I'll be damned. Naruto's sudden announcement caught both Armin and Mina off guard. He's still alive. Then more softly, I didn't think he was like me. That's not possible, sensei. Armin argued, refusing to cling to false hope. I was there. Just trust me on this, kid, came the curt reply. Eren will be fine. Right now, we need to worry about ourselves. Trust you. But Naruto would say no more. Anyway, it's about time we did something about this. He decided suddenly, his head snapping toward the south. I can sense a lot of people over there. Without another word, he leapt off the roof, his maneuver gears launching him across the sky in a cloud of wind. That's right. Armin remembered. Naruto doesn't use gas to propel himself. He uses the wind. Thanks to his immense reserve of chakra and natural affinity for air itself, a gas-propelled tank wasn't needed. So long as he had wires, he could traverse the city without fear of running out of fuel. If anything, it made him even deadly than he 3 years before when he was without the 3D maneuver gear. Then when one recalled his abilities as a master shinobi with almost limitless jutsu and no need to worry about a limited blade supply. He really is built for killing titans. Let's go, Armin. Mina was suddenly ahead of him, repelling after the rapidly retreating blonde. We don't want to be left behind. Hi. Together they took off after Naruto. It was only when the latter slowed his pace that they were able to catch him. What are you planning, sensei? Armin was hesitant to ask. He knew Naruto well enough by now to know that the blonde's plans were often well conceived and disastrous for those he plotted against. Alas, his only response was to laugh. Once more, Mina Carolina was reminded just how much admired and why she secretly loved this soldier standing before her. It wasn't just his good looks, although those were certainly a factor. It was his charisma. He was as much a man of words as he was action, his very presence could inspire dozens to do the acts of thousands. And then there was that foxy grin on his face. Yes, this was why she loved Uzumaki Naruto. And why she could never tell him, what could someone so extraordinary possibly want with someone so ordinary as her? Sensei, she asked once more, echoing Armin's question. You said it was time for something. What exactly might that be? Naruto's grin looked like it belonged on Lucifer himself. To mount our counterattack. Oi, Jean, what do we do now? What can we do? Jean Kirkstein hung his head low, refusing to encourage Connie any further. We finally received the order to retreat, but we can't get over the wall because we're out of gas. And my chakra's so low right now that I'd probably only make it up halfway. We're all going to die thanks to those fucking cowards in the support squad. He gazed up at the dark skies overhead. It looked as though it was going to rain any moment now. Damn. He felt so pathetic right now. Absolutely wrecked. Most of the survivors had gathered here on the rooftops. There were only a few dozen remaining out of the hundreds that had been sent out to exterminate the Titans. Granted, he'd helped to save a few, but in doing so, he'd all but exhausted his reserves. Chakra-enhanced speed could only save so many after all. A nagging sense of guilt silently condemned him for the many he hadn't been able to save. Completely pathetic. He hadn't changed at all. Back then, he'd volunteered for the training solely to impress Mikasa. It hadn't worked. He should have known she only had eyes for the instructor. He'd gotten a few skills out of it, true, but his outlook on life had yet to change. If only they had waited one more day. Then he would have been safe in the interior with the military police. That's why we have to go all in on those Titans. Connie would not be denied. Their only way out was to race into the headquarters, deal with them, and retrieve the gas. The only other option was to avoid them until they eventually ran out of gas. And that meant death. No matter what option they took, they were still screwed. Damn needle. He swore. This is hopeless. Sasha Browse was of the exact opposite opinion. She knew from first-hand experience that. Let's do it. She urged her fellow recruits. Stand up. If we all work together, we can do it. I'll be in front. It's your business if you want to get yourself killed, Potato Girl, don't drag us into it. One of them murmured. Her enthusiasm was met with despondent looks and sorrowed faces. All those gathered here had lost someone to the Titans. They'd survived through pure luck or outright cowardice. Sasha herself was one of the lucky few that had managed to escape the worst of it all, a testament to Naruto's harsh training. He'd praised her for two things, her endless appetite and her unbelievable physical endurance. Compared to Jean, he'd called her a living example of a Jonin once, her affinity for Earth gave her nearly limitless reserves of stamina. Come on now, yet again, she tried to rouse them to action. If we all work together, I'm sure we can. Shut up, you elitist. Accused another. You had that special training. We didn't. Are you planning to leave us behind so you can scale the wall yourself? Sasha opened her mouth to deny that fact, and just as quickly snapped it shut. They were right. She hadn't used any of her chakra yet. If she really wanted to, she could easily run up the wall to safety. So why hadn't she? Only a handful of these people were known to her, she had no real obligations to any of them now that the order to retreat had been sounded. With her speed she could easily outrun any Titan on her own, so that definitely wasn't fear holding her back, so. Why was she still standing around? Oh, I wish Sensei were here. Wish granted. Well now, I see a bunch of idle hands standing around. Heads snapped up like puppets severed from their strings, spooked by the sound of that authoritative voice. Sasha and Jean simultaneously stiffened, because they knew that voice. Its owner had made these last 3 years of their lives absolute hell. They stood straight and erect as Uzumaki Naruto dropped down from the skies with a snarl, his boots biting into the rooftop tiles with a harsh crunch. Armin and Mina landed behind him seconds later, their faces carefully blank. Sasha had to forcibly restrain herself from running to him. Naruto radiated confidence on an almost primal level. Now that he was here to take command, the burden of having their lives wouldn't fall on her. What the hell are you doing, Jean? He growled, advancing on his student. I taught you better than this. But nothing was what he'd expected to hear. Instead, his mentor simply glowered at him for a long moment. Then he sighed. You did well to survive, Naruto said at last, knocking his disciple once upon the noggin. Rest easy. I'll take things from here. Without another word, he moved on past him to speak with Annie, then the others. Sasha almost couldn't believe it. He'd completely ignored her. Sasha. Hi. She stiffened in expectation, but it was not Naruto who had called out her name, it was Mikasa. She'd just enough time to see the raven-haired girl descend from a rooftop, nearly crashing into her in her haste to land safely before she found herself accosted by her fell trainee. Have you seen Eren's unit? She asked. No, Sasha shook her head, but Naruto-sensei's over there with Armin and. Mikasa shot past her like an arrow loosed from a bow. Mina, she finished in disbelief. Geez, she's quick. Naruto. The blonde turned, not at all alarmed to find his most talented student approaching him at a run. It seemed most of the survivors had gathered here after all, and now Mikasa was amongst them. Good. He expected no less from his star pupil. What he wasn't expecting was for her to grab his hand. Beside him, Mina bristled. I thought you were outside the walls. Surprise, surprise, the blonde held up Mina's spent Hiraishi kunai from the necklace around her neck. You can thank her that I'm here at all. I managed to warn the Legion, so they should be here before nightfall. She really saved your skins. Mina flushed, her indignation momentarily forgotten in the wake of this unexpected praise. It was nothing, sensei. Don't dismiss yourself so easily. Naruto laughed, drawing her close. If you hadn't used that kunai, most of them probably wouldn't be alive right now. Armin, have you seen Eren? Mikasa chose that moment to ask the one question no one wanted to hear. Mina's smile shattered like so much glass. Crap, Armin thought to himself. How can I look her in the face and tell her what happened? We were separated from him. Naruto cut in smoothly. He knew Mikasa, she cared for her brother more than anything. Ordinarily, that wouldn't have been a problem. But with her newfound skill set, not to mention the unhealthy amount of chakra she'd taken from Kurama 3 years ago, her emotional state was a cause for concern. The last thing he needed was a destabilized killer on his hands. He didn't have the time or the energy to suppress her if she went on a rampage now, and with Kurama's chakra trapped in her coils, that was a very distinct possibility. He's alive, Naruto reassured her. I know it. That suicidal bastard's probably out there killing titans as we speak. Mikasa looked as though she wanted to say more, but she chose to accept his words. After all, Naruto would never lie to her, right? No, of course not. She was so caught up in her thoughts that she almost missed the blonde's relieved sigh. Why had he done that? When he placed his hand upon her shoulder, however, all her worries and concerns simply ceased to be. It was like flicking a switch. Trust me on this, all right, he said softly. As soon as we wipe out the titans at the supply depot, I'll help you look for him. Understood. Hi, sensei. Crisis averted. Damn, I woulda liked to see her go crazy, the kitsune sulked sullenly. She's keeping an awful lot of emotion tamped down in there. Now's not the time for that, and you know it. I don't feel like fending off a mini you at the moment. So, his partner challenged. Just how do you intend to get these fools up and running, then? Like this. Oi, Mikasa. His star prodigy turned. Is this everyone who hasn't made it over the wall? I think so. Good. Naruto was already striding forward, reaching for his sword. Then if that's the case, we don't need to wait any longer. Listen up, maggots. Naruto thrust his blade high, commanding the attention of all assembled there. I know, you're afraid. Some of you may even be terrified. That is understandable. You're weak. But I am strong. I will protect each of you with my life, I swear this on my Nindo. Stand behind me and I will lead you to victory. Our counterattack begins now, but in order for it to succeed, I'll need your help. Silence reigned supreme. It seemed not even Naruto's presence could galvanize them, Jean thought to himself. He was, after all, only human. Right. Lowering his blade, the blonde sighed and crossed his hands together in an all too familiar shape. Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. A plume of smoke echoed his words, one that dissipated just as quickly, revealing a startling sigh. There was a silence as the cadets beheld these sudden and unexpected reinforcements. They'd each witnessed this jutsu firsthand on their very first day of training, but not like this. Instead of summoning 6 clones, he'd created dozens, each armed with maneuver gear and weapons, same as the original. They lined the streets around them, perched upon towers, stood upon rooftops, swarming the area for miles around. Gasps arose up from the cadets. No one had been expecting so many to appear upon his command. Are you with me? They demanded as one. Speak now, or stay here and die. As one they set out, each of them diverging in separate directions until only the original remained. He wasn't about to babysit them, some would die no matter what he did. He and his clones would protect these cadets, as best they could. That was all he could do. They were only human after all. But being human, as he'd come to discover, wasn't quite so bad after all. He turned his head, catching Mikasa's eye, holding her gaze in silent obscurity, knowing at once that she would follow him if he stepped off this rooftop, perhaps even to her death. Most of these recruits did not know what they were getting into, yet he'd still chosen to shoulder the responsibility of their lives anyway. Those with the will to live and fight for tomorrow, follow me now. Without another word, he erupted into motion, hurtling into the air, refusing to look back. He'd done all he could. The rest was up to them. If only Erwin and the others weren't so far away, they likely wouldn't make it back to the wall until evening. Until then, the task fell to him to keep these kids alive. No pressure, right? Did I mention I love your sense of humor? Ha! It wasn't long before they caught movement in their parafields. Evidently his words had an effect after all. It was only when that same movement resolved itself into the shape of a titan that Naruto realized he might have underestimated the fear his students had felt. They were probably still back there, knees knocking together. Or not. Laughter leapt from his lips as the titan died behind him, all without so much as raising a finger in his direction. He didn't have to look back to know who had slain it. A puff of gas resounded in his ears, followed by a shock of familiar blonde hair, and then she was there, gliding next to him as though she'd always been there. Idiot, Annie mumbled as she came to drift beside him, her cold crystal eyes boring into his. Was that honestly supposed to inspire us back there? You're here now, aren't you? TCH. She turned aside, trying to escape his gaze. It's just because I want to be the one to kill you. Hi, whatever helps you sleep at night. Naruto replied as their gear carried them around a corner. So, what got you moving? You can thank that ace student of yours, his fellow blonde grumbled. She got everyone moving. I'm just the first to catch up to you. Oh, flashback. It was like flicking a switch, Annie realized. Murmurs of confusion warped into whispers of approval from those remaining. Everyone was suddenly glancing this way and that, all too aware that their best chance of survival had just flown on ahead of them. With Naruto and his clones gone, what chance did they stand against the Titans? You're either incompetent or spineless cowards. Mikasa snapped, diving after him almost immediately. Within seconds, she was little more than a speck on the horizon, a trail of gas, the only sign that she'd ever been there at all. Armin sniffed and scrubbed at his face with the back of a hand. Seconds later, he too was sailing through the air after her. Not one to be outdone by her fellow students, Mina was swift to join them. Annie'd just begun to move herself when Jean sighed somewhere beside her. She could read his face like an open book. Anger, frustration at his own powerlessness. Any minute now and he'd say something. Oi, were we trained to let our comrades fight alone? At this rate, we're going to turn out to be spineless cowards. With a roar he lunged after Mina, his cry carrying on into the distance. Didn't expect to hear that from him. Reiner murmured. Guess we might as well lend a hand. That did it. Hey, cowards. Weaklings. Retards. Sasha was the next to leap into oblivion, racing after their mentor. End flashback. So, she asked. I take it you have a plan to keep us alive. Don't I always? I'm not even going to dignify that with a response. Here they come. Both blondes turned to regard the one who had spoken. The latter was lightly amused to find that it was Sasha who had spoken, taking Naruto's flank. Annie didn't envy her that position. Although the skies were swiftly growing black with the bodies of the recruits, so too were the streets filling with titans, the behemoths now attracted by the presence of so many humans in one area. If Naruto didn't do something soon, this might be a mass ace after all. There he went. Scatter and advance at all costs. Naruto shouted. Don't slow down, not even for an instant, or they'll catch you. His words carried on ahead of her as the vanguard finally reached the first wave of titans, then there was only blood and battle. Some weren't quick enough to heed his command. 6 recruits were caught or dead before they knew what had happened. Everything seemed to move very slowly after that. It was almost as if the gods themselves had stopped to take personal notice of the carnage unfolding in the streets. Mikasa was quick to distinguish herself amongst the combatants, effortlessly slaying 3 titans without even pausing to adjust her course. Mina Dani's surprise proved exact opposite. The once shy and reserved girl now struck out at titans with borderline reckless behavior. Armin actually gained his first kill in that battle, despite being scared half to death by the carnage raging around him. Marco and Berthold nearly got eaten for their reckless stunts. Jean and Reiner were forced to double back just to save their comrades. Others weren't quite so fortunate. Annie cringed. A girl beside was snared out of the air by a titan, its massive fist crushing her body to a pulp. Ahead of her, a boy lost control of his maneuver gear and flew right into a titan's maw. His screams echoed in her ears as she rushed past, knowing it would mean death to attempt a rescue. She could see the fury etched into their faces. They're powerless at knowing their fate. Naruto's clones proved an admirable distraction, but there's simply too many titans for him to save everyone. Where we all these titans coming from? With each loss, Naruto became more and more aggressive. He simply tore through whomever and whatever barred his way. There was no subtlety or grace in his movements. Annie realized he'd taken advantage of his nearly immortal body and used it to devastating effect. His chakra allowed him to make savage turns that would have torn most men in half, his hands and blades ripping into any giant foolish enough to accost him. And there were many who dared do just that, aberrants drawn to him by his unique chakra, eager to devour him, swallow him whole. They all died. Whether by blade or fist or Rasenshuriken, he cut them down uncaring for what happened to his body. Annie soon lost track of his count altogether. It had to be somewhere in the 50s by now. He truly is a beast, she thought to herself. Sheathed in that strange golden shroud of his, he simply weathered their attacks and eviscerated their bodies into unrecognizable shapes. He became little more than a blur, working harder and harder to preserve the ever-dwindling number of cadets under his command. Advance. He commanded those remaining. Do not waste the sacrifices of your fallen comrades. Advance. Yes, sir. Annie had to hand it to him. Naruto really did know how to take command of a situation. He allowed them no time for grief, ushering them ever onward before their feelings of regrets and sorrow could overcome them and leave their bodies crippled with fear. 3 more died before they reached the halfway point, before Naruto finally skidded to a halt on a rooftop and flung out a hand. All units. Halt. Boots skidded and tiles crunched as the 20 remaining recruits of the original 30 slid to a halt beside and behind him, wondering why he'd called them to stop. They soon saw why. 2 titans were headed in their direction, each easily larger than 14 meters each. One wasn't even worthy of mention with its spindly frame, the other however proved another matter entirely. What the hell was that? No sudden movements. Naruto warned, leaving Annie to question his judgment once more. Ignoring the adrenaline pounding in her ears, she risked a glance at the second titan. Muscled from head to toe, it cut an imposing figure amidst the carnage, striding forward with thick footfalls utterly uncaring of everything in its path. Wait, if it continued its path would eventually take it right past their vantage point. Annie got a better look at it as it stormed forward, its shaggy brown hair obscuring pointed ears and furious angry eyes. It was truly a fearsome thing to behold up close. Its square jaw derfeted open as it neared them, its mouth creaking apart with a ponderous creaking. Sasha whimpered softly to herself at the sight, unnerving several recruits. We should kill it, Mina hissed. Quickly, before it gets any closer. Steady, Naruto said, raising his hand for calm. Steady. Still closer it came, bounding forward with its inexorable stride. Sensei, Sasha squealed. Steady. And then, just when Annie was absolutely certain they were going to die a fool's death because of this blonde baka of a captain. ROOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOO run and bounded right past them, never once sparing them so much as a second glance. Annie felt her mouth drift open, her lips forming a silent O as the 15-meter type cannoned into its fellow Titan with all the force of a hurricane. They grappled with one another for a brief instant. It soon became apparent that the abnormal-looking one held the advantage in terms of strength alone, if not skill. Raah! Breaking free, it lashed out like an axe, clenched knuckles slamming into the smaller Titan's head, all but launching its skull from its shoulders in a grisly gout of gore. The recruits watched disbelieving, as the severed skull crashed into a building miles away, its grotesque visage twisted in the agony of its last moments. Its body seemed to have other plans, however. The headless figure made a singular attempt to rise before the Titan stomped down on the nape of its neck, ending its life. What the hell? Jean hissed angrily. Did that fucker just finish it off? Armin finished with a gasp, disbelieving. But how did it know about the Titan's weakness? Connie frowned. It must be an abnormal. Naruto's lips curved up in a slight, secret smile. That a boy, Eren. So I'm guessing it's time for the second phase. Pretty much. Jean, he shouted. You're in charge. Get them to the supply tower quickly. I'll meet up with you once I've finished up here. His words had a rippling effect on the others. Why was he suddenly leaving? It didn't make any sense. None at all. Was he abandoning them, leaving them to their fate so he could scale the wall on his own? Why me? Jean gaped. We were doing just fine with you in charge. Huh, Naruto growled. Is the student questioning the teacher again? No, I mean, no sir. Then hop to it. He snapped. I'm counting on you. Annie. You're with me. We'll help that abnormal suppress the Titans around the tower. I can help, too. I'll be fine. The blonde waved Mikasa's concerns aside, ignoring her as she edged forward. You're needed elsewhere. Annie and I don't need gas to maneuver. But, Mikasa, go. The black Hisa stated a moment longer, torn between duty and decision. Then she darted forward, placing a swift kiss upon his lips. Her mouth seemed stuck there, as though she would never pull away. There was a silence, one swiftly broken. Choking gasps arose out of the recruits, they couldn't believe their eyes. Mikasa had just kissed the instructor. Such a thing was unheard of, even here in this time of crisis. Mina gaped. Kissed him. Sasha was of the same mind. So was Annie. What the hell, Mikasa? Please don't die, sensei. Mikasa whispered as she pulled away, her cheeks burnished the faintest shade of pink. And then she was gone, whisking off into the distance before anyone could question what she had done at all. Naruto was left standing there, eyes and mouth working wordlessly. For the first time in the last 3 years, he truly was without words. What the hell? He hadn't been expecting that. No one could have expected that. How was he supposed to cope with the sudden knowledge that he'd been kissed by the same girl he'd spent the last 3 years training? Granted, the age gap between them had shrunk to only a year now, but a kiss. What the hell was he supposed to say to that? How about, Booyah, Urasai, I feel the same. Before he knew what was happening, Mina was there flowing like the water that was her element, flinging her arms round his neck. Thankfully, her lips found his cheek, not his face. Please, don't take any unnecessary risks, teacher. She pleaded softly before disengaging and repelling away. Good luck, sensei. Armin saluted against his chest and took off after Mina. Sasha was the next to approach him. Browse, you too. Naruto groaned. What the hell is this, worship Naruto Day? I'm not complaining. Of course you're not, ya lecherous fox. But Sasha didn't kiss him. She simply wrapped her arms around his chest and squeezed as tightly as she could, burying her face in his jacket. It was only then that he realized she was crying, sobbing into the fabrics of his cloak and shirt. She held tight to him, as though to release him meant the end of her. I'm very grateful for everything you taught me. She gasped out, diving towards the tower before he could utter so much as a word. Jean was the next and very last to confront him, leaving the blonde to hope Krista and Ymir had somehow been able to make it over the wall. If they hadn't. Are you sure about this? He glanced at the dozens of titans swarming the square, growing closer with each passing instant. Soon they'd be overrun. Oi oi, you guys are acting like I'm gonna die or something. Naruto forced a rough laugh. Get out of here, you slacker. Do your job. Just be careful, teach. I don't want to hear that from someone like you. Naruto watched, quietly and patiently waiting as the cadets flung themselves off the rooftop, hurtling towards, then through the windows of the supply depot. Only when he was certain that they'd made their escape did he finally turn to face Annie. She was giving him an icy glare that could have put Haku to shame. Was she jealous? Why did you want me to stay with you? She demanded to know as they leapt to another rooftop, away from the encroaching horde. You would have been of better use in there. Naruto shook his head, clearing himself of confusion, and offered a lopsided smile. I wanted to discuss the coordinate, also known as that titan over there. He indicated the rogue titan with a finger, still rampaging against the other titans in the face of all overwhelming odds. I'm willing to wager you know who it is, don't you? Within a heartbeat he felt the killer intent. She was angry. No, she was beyond angry. She was pissed. Ho, that's some fine killing intent you have there. Naruto tittered softly. You only have yourself to blame, you talk in your sleep, after all. For the first time since he'd met her, Annie Lenhart actually flushed, the slow coloring of her face left her literally unable to speak. You snuck into my room. Just once last month. Naruto shrugged. Boy was I surprised, I had no idea you liked to sleep in. I swear I'll kill you. Relax, I was bluffing. He grinned. That was just a guess. But by all means, thanks for the information. Annie grimaced, refusing to speak. She'd been had. Once again she'd underestimated Naruto's intelligence. She really didn't like where this was going, not at all. Why, I already know. Naruto continued. It's Eren, of course. I knew at the moment I realized he was still alive. Only a titan can survive in another titan's stomach. He must have transformed and tore his way out of there in order to escape. I understand that. What I don't understand is how or where he got that from. He's had the ability for quite some time now, it's merely been dormant inside him. Don't you find it strange? How would a boy like him suddenly gain the ability to shift like you and me? Annie refused to answer. Ryaaaargh. Both blondes turned at the sound of the scream, alarmed to find the rogue titan Eren howling in pain. The reason for his agony became quite obvious as they beheld the other titans continuing to chew upon it. Having lost both of its limbs since they last looked, it seemed almost certain he would die for real this time. And the coordinate with him. Her mind made up, Annie drew her blade. Maddened with fury, Eren bounded forward, despite all the titans weighing him down. He had eyes for one last target, and abnormal that unbeknownst to Annie was responsible for devouring Thomas hours before. With a scream that put the gods to shame, Eren shook himself free of his captors and with one final leap locked tight his jaw round the creature's neck. Still screaming, he hoisted its spindly body high, then higher still, until the only thing holding it aloft was his jaw strength alone, his broad teeth biting deep into the nape. His gaze snapped towards those he had shaken off, eyes green and narrow. With a single swing of the dead body, he flattened them, grinding their bodies to bloody smears in the streets. Then straightening, he dropped from his crouch and swung again, tossing its body into an approaching titan, sending both beasts crashing through a nearby building. Steam spurting from his jaws, Eren dropped what little remained of the neck, leering in the direction in which he'd thrown Thomas's killer. Oi! Naruto whistled. Did he just beat that motherfucker with another motherfucker? ROOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOOO heavens, sending the earth itself shaking. Then his eyes rolled back. His body sank forward, crashing to his knees, plowing face first into the dirt. It did not rise again. He must have finally burned himself out, Annie realized. Even as a Titan, one only had so much stamina. And still, other Titans were coming. There had to be hundreds of them now, drawn by the close concentration of humans and Naruto's irresistible life force. This was bad. If they reached Eren's body and devoured him before he could be extracted, then Annie started towards him, just a little, but it was more than enough to confirm her mentor's suspicions. I knew it. Naruto's smile grew another inch. For whatever reason, your objective is, and always has been Eren. That got an answer out of her. What are you going to do? Naruto laughed. What do you think I'm gonna do? Annie didn't have a chance to answer, because at that very instant, a giant hand closed around her mentor. It came from out of nowhere, lunging across the rooftops to grab him, its massive fingers squeezing down in the blink of an eye, binding both arms to his sides. Everything happened so swiftly, even as Annie reached for her blade, her mentor was hoisted high off the ground and brought towards the creature's mouth. Blue eyes widened hopelessly, powerlessly as its jaws creaked open wide. Sinuva. Naruto didn't hesitate either, he bit down on his lower lip, drawing blood even as the Titan began to stuff him into his maw. Bakram. At this distance, Annie was nearly blown back off her feet by the transformation. The wind threatened to pick her up and launch her into the air. Naruto's Titan form burst out of the smoke in all its towering glory, 6 hands locking around the Titan's face and neck. Cruel crimson eyes leered down at the beast that had tried and failed to devour him, his fanged maw curved back in a warped facade of a smile as he gazed upon his prey. A soft sigh plugged itself between his teeth, building in volume until finally. Jean glanced up as the building shook around them, trembling at its very foundations. What was that noise just now? It had sounded familiar. Almost like, nah. That wasn't possible. Naruto wasn't a Titan, right? What a stupid thought. Shaking his head of such thoughts, they were in the midst of planning to take their gas back, thanks to Armin's plan. But without Naruto and Annie, this involved an awful lot of risk. Now that they had all but run out of gas, they had to gamble everything on this plan, armed with only shotguns and blades. Why the hell did he put me in charge? He wondered aloud as he loaded the rifle. It's not like I'm cut out for this sort of thing. Just the thought of it made him wonder why he'd put up with this crap to begin with. Naruto had always been there from the start, always pushing him for more, always forcing him to strive then excel until finally the day came when he reached the top 10 graduates. Naruto had pushed himself out of himself, and Jean hated him for that. He was making him think. Strive to be more than he could ever be, when he really wanted only to live safely in the interior. Damn him for being so persistent. For pushing him into this leadership role. Another tremor shook the building, closer this time. Oi, just what's going on out there? He wondered aloud. Naruto, Annie, you'd better not get yourselves killed and leave me in charge here, damn it. Annie Lenhart had never felt so conflicted in all her life. It had only been 5 minutes since Naruto had transformed, since the rogue titan had fallen, and already, she knew the outcome. Even for all his speed and power and might, even with Eren's rampage having slaughtered so many, Naruto simply couldn't hope to handle the titans on his own. Slowly, but surely, he was being overwhelmed. An arm here, a leg there. It didn't matter how swiftly he regenerated, or that he was easily the largest titan for miles around. There were dozens of them and only one of him. It was a testament to his incredible fighting skills that he'd lasted this long without support, that he was even alive at all. But Annie could see the end in sight now. He was finished, he just didn't know it yet. Naruto couldn't do both. He couldn't defend the building, himself, and Eren's prone titan form. Not at the same time, even with all those arms. If he only had to worry about himself, then maybe he'd be alright. But with so many lives at stake, and so much to protect, he was hard pressed to meet the task. Too pressed. She watched him thrash around with gusto, crushing two titans against one another with his bare palms, his remaining arms working tirelessly to fend off the horde even as it worked to stream around him. He wouldn't be able to keep this up for much longer, regeneration only counted for so much after all. Why doesn't he just use his other form? If he transformed into that monstrous kitsune, then those things wouldn't stand a chance. He'd crush them in an instant, along with the rest of the town and any survivors who might be hiding nearby. It was then and only then that Annie truly understood. Naruto could easily shift into his Biju form. He'd simply chosen not to, knowing that he might trample innocents and buildings underfoot. It made sense that he would his smaller, but by no means less deadly Titan form. The same form that was slowly getting ripped to pieces by those Titans. You idiot. Annie knew she should hate him for what he'd done to her. This boy had nearly made Titan feed out of her 3 years before. Since then he'd kept a close eye on her at all times, despite bringing her up, despite all but entrusting her with his most powerful techniques. And yet there had been times when he was kind. Caring, even. He was a ruthless teacher but also a goofball, a hopeless klutz when it came to using the 3D maneuver gear, his skills so poor that she'd actually had to teach him how to use it while he was teaching her. It was almost laughable. No, it was laughable. Yes, she hated him. Loathed him. Abhorred his very existence. But she hated even more to see him die, to watch a good man die when he didn't have to. It no longer mattered if he possessed the coordinate or not now anymore, she'd already made up her mind. She didn't want him to die. And she knew what she had to do. Annie tugged at her collar and wrapped her lower face in cloth, hoping it might better serve to hide her identity. Without looking back, she loped into an alleyway, ducking into the first door available. Silently praying for his safety, she set about wrapping her face with strips of cloth, completely obscuring her visage. Even then, she could still hear his struggle raging outside the battle he was bound to lose if someone didn't do something to help him. She could be that someone. She could do something. But what about her mission? At the last instant, she hesitated. She couldn't risk being discovered, and if she were, who knew what Bertholdt or Reiner might do to her? But if she didn't do something, and soon. Damn it. Annie placed both fingers in her mouth and, visualizing her goal, bit down. Hard. Save him. She had to save him. Consequences be damned. Foul liquor spurted into her mouth, causing her to gag back on her own blood for a terrifying instant as she awaited the transformation. But nothing happened. Nothing at all. Oh no. No, no, no. Not now. Her feelings, her duty to her people were getting in the way. Again. Shrieking in frustration, bit down again, nearly severing her thumbs in the process. Come on. She nearly screamed. Come on. Unbidden, her mind flashed back to those very words. Flashback. Come on. Naruto stood over her, laughing. Another round. Another victory. Another loss. Annie lay there, looking up at him, struggling not to shout. How many times did that make it now? She didn't want to remember. Time and time again he'd knocked her down, and time again, he demanded that she stand back up. You have an amazing technique, he complimented her. Who taught you? My father, she supplied sullenly. So, your old man could. Who cares? Annie snapped at him, glowering as she found her footing. Doing this is pointless. I can't beat you as I am now. And besides, anti-personnel techniques don't factor into our scores anyway. She indicated the other cadets with a glance, many of whom weren't even trying at all. So, everyone just takes it easy until it's over. I'm sure a big, suicidal bastard like you wouldn't know this, but the right to join the military police and live in the secure inner district is only granted to the top scoring 10 graduates. The only people who bother participating in this are either stupidly serious like your disciples, or seriously stupid. You're one of my students too, Annie. So, she lunged at him then, trying to sweep his legs out from under him. Naruto laughed and jumped over her sweep, his boots touching the small of her back as he sprang off and over her. For someone who claimed to be only human time and time again, he was certainly agile. Why in this world are the people most capable of opposing the Titans the only ones given the privilege of avoiding them entirely? She countered, grabbing his fist when he struck out at her stomach. How do you think it got to be such a farce? Who knows? Naruto grabbed her elbow in turn, twisting it behind her back. I'm only human. I can't possibly hope to understand such things. Then maybe it's just human nature. Maybe. He did something with his right leg then, she couldn't tell what. Whatever he'd done, their spar ended the same as it always did, with her on the ground and him standing over her. Annie closed her eyes and sighed, her gaze drifting up into the cloudy afternoon sky. Another loss. She'd spared with Naruto a grand total of 50 times now, and never once had she come close to victory. It was humiliating. How could someone be so skilled in combat as to just brush her aside like that? Point is, I can't know, I won't even pretend to be stupid enough to play soldier in this insane world. Never. Because of your mission. Naruto knew better than to mention the truth of what she was not with so many witnesses present. She wasn't quite as paranoid about it as she'd been 3 years before, but it still rankled her for him to discuss it so openly. Yeah, she retaliated. Like I said, never. So stop trying to be nice to me. A hand thrust itself before her vision. Never say never, Annie. Skiing softly to herself, she accepted his hand. End flashback. Naruto. Bakram. The building erupted around her as her titan form grew around her, sheathing her body in layers of superheated bone and muscle. Annie didn't wait for her new body to finish forming, nor did she stop to ponder on this sudden cause for her clarity. She was already bounding forward, into the rubble, smashing through buildings in a haste to get to her fellow blonde. She clenched her knuckles and willed them to harden, a flesh and bone fist becoming hard and stiff as she raced to greet the enemy. The first titan to meet her fist didn't know what had hit it. One moment, it had been gnawing upon Naruto's shoulder, the next, her diamond-hard knuckles launched it halfway across the town. In the face of this new and unexpected threat, the other Titans began to turn, but too late, she was already amongst them, lashing out with overwhelming speed and precision. Her body was a raging hurricane and the Titans mere bricks and stones before her wrath, blown away into bloodied pieces before her wrath. Raaaaargh. A furious scream left her lips and deafened her enemies, giving life to the maelstrom of emotion raging inside her chest. Kill. She'd kill them all for what they'd done. Each and every one of them. Her mind slipped into a black haze, there were only the enemies before her, only the urge, the need to kill. So kill she did. She tore and ripped and ravaged everything in her path, tearing them away from the battered blonde in a series of swift submission holds and back-breaking blows. Between the two of them, the remaining Titans didn't stand a chance. Caught between the elegant female Titan and the overwhelming speed and power of the six-armed Titan, they found themselves swiftly eradicated, reduced to little more than gory smears upon the walls and buildings. Their slaughter seemed to last forever, when in reality, it probably lasted only a couple of minutes. They killed nearly 100 Titans together in that square, moving with a teamwork established over the last 3 years. It felt wonderful. Wonderful to resume her Titan form, to throw herself into battle without pause or preamble, to decimate the enemy without thought or cause. And when it was finally over, when the blood of her foes stained the streets and sizzled in her hair, Annie finally allowed herself to think. Naruto turned to regard her, his red eyes wide with disbelief, or so she thought. Then they narrowed, and she could see the pride shimmering within those deep crimson depths. When he extended a clenched fist, Annie felt her heart skip a beat. After all this, was he actually good? Job, he ground out, still holding up his clenched knuckles. Despite herself, Annie laughed, and her Titan body laughed with her. Baka. Tenderly, Annie returned the motion, bumping fists with him for the first time since they'd met. It was quite a comical sight, two titans bumping fists together, grinning like a pair of complete idiots. That wasn't far from the mark, she felt like a complete idiot just then. But it was the first time she'd smiled in what felt like forever, and it felt damned good. Look out, titans. Annie caught motion out of the corner of her eye just then. Mikasa and the others had finally emerged from within the supply depots at long last, their tanks filled to the maximum. It was time for her to disappear while she still had the chance. She didn't need to rely on gas thanks in part to her wind affinity, she could climb the wall later at her leisure. She didn't have to worry about Eren's fate, either. Knowing Naruto, he would make certain that he done his utmost to res right now, all that remained was to run. And so she did. Annie raised one giant finger to her lips for silence, then she bolted. Naruto didn't waste any time either, she saw him already sprinting towards Eren's prone titan form and stabbing his hand into the neck, extracting him from the now shriveled up corpse. Cries of shock and surprise rose up from his students, echoing in her ears as she raw. Annie didn't pay them any heed, she was far too focused on getting the hell out of here somewhere safe where she could shed her titan form without anyone noticing that glaring sight of her female form. Shame flooded her as reality set in, her moment of emotion might have cost her most dear, ruining her mission altogether. Forever. Idiot. She was cursing herself even as she ran for the safety of the wall, her transformation coming undone around her. She had to run. She had to get away and hide before someone other than Naruto finally made the connection between herself and the appearance of the female titan. It was stupid. Absurd. She'd risked exposure all to help him. What was she going to do when Reiner and Berhold found out? And they would find out, she knew this in her heart, because she'd seen them. And if she had seen them, then they'd seen her. By the gods, what had she done? What have I done? I believe Eren could be a valuable asset to humanity, sir. Silence. I will not tolerate this insubordination. It's no use, Armin. Naruto sighed. The poor fool has lost his mind. It'd be better if I showed him. Sensei. Oi, fool. Naruto called up at the commander. You wanted proof that Eren's on your side, right? Well then. Watch this. Sighing, Naruto bit down on his thumb. Hard. Sensei. Bwah. Naruto cried out in surprise as he found himself swarmed by his students, nearly bowled over, when Mina and the others rushed him. He hadn't been expecting this. Were he in his titan form, he wouldn't have budged so much as an inch. But now that he was human again, it was another matter. He found himself knocked to the ground, wincing as a fresh lance of agony coursed down his spine when his back struck the stones and scraped across his skin. It hurt. But it was a good pain, the kind one felt after surviving a long, arduous mission and returning to the welcoming arms of a loved one. Or loved ones, in this case. Plural. As in more than one. Oh, happy day. I know what it means, Baka Kitsune. Well, excuse me for celebrating. I'm just happy that finally have so many potential successors. Can't argue with you there. And thus, for the first time in centuries, Uzumaki Naruto found himself in the awkward position of having two girls fussing over him. Before he knew it, Sasha had him by one arm and Mina the other. Krista herself was practically in tears upon seeing him alive and well. It took Ymir a good 5 minutes to calm her friend down and reassure her that the blonde bastard wouldn't be going anywhere anytime soon. For a bunch of kids who hadn't expected him to come back, Naruto mused, they'd reacted most prudently. Disappearing for an hour must have had them worried sick, but it had been necessary. I'm back, he supplied with a small smile. Now nearly an hour later, here he was. He'd barely had time to make the excuse of searching for survivors before Mina and Sasha had tackled him. He could see Jean standing off to one side, carefully avoiding his gaze whenever he looked, trying and failing to hide himself behind a nearby table. Naruto was just about to ask what was bothering him when the girls began tugging on his arms again. Are you hurt anywhere, sensei? Sasha asked, her brown orbs flicking over his battered body. Are you hungry? Do you need any food? Absently, he noted the half-eaten loaf of bread in her hand. Oh, the irony. Sasha was asking him if was hungry when she herself had food. Definitely his student. Not like she'd share though. I have bandages. Mina added. Naruto turned his head to regard the blacket, this girl who by all rights, should have been dead by now. A cross-shaped scar on her temple where a titan's tooth had grazed her was the only indication that she'd nearly been devoured hours before. She had claimed her first kill minutes later. In her hands she clutched a roll of gauze, obviously not meant for her, but for him. Pity she didn't know about his regeneration. Sensei needs food first, the brunette insisted, pushing past her. Did you see how hard he was fighting down there? He's probably starving. What? Sasha, don't be silly. Mina laughed. You can feed them after I tend his wounds. He doesn't have any. And how do you know that? How would you know if he didn't? Sparks shot between their eyes. Naruto knew that look all too well. Food. Bandages. Food. Bandages. Okay, okay. His grunts dissolved into laughter when they wouldn't let go of his arms. Mina. Sasha. I'm fine. Really, I am. Physically, at least. As far as his attire was concerned, not so much. He'd lost his cloak and half of his shirt in his maddened scramble to get up the wall, and no amount of regeneration could return those. Come to think of it, wasn't this kind of awkward? What with two girls clinging to either arm and another crying over him, with the former stealing the occasional glance at his scarred, muscular chest. Really, it was. And yet Naruto found he didn't mind it as much as he should have now that the danger was past. It was only natural that they were concerned, that they were staring, bleeding. Wait a minute. That last one didn't make one iota of sense. Ah, Mina. Your nose. Ha. It's bleeding. The blackhead blinked for a long moment, her hand slowly traveling to her face. Sure enough, it came away bloody. Her eyes grew large and wide. There was a silence, long and dreadful, as she finally realized everyone was staring at her. More pointedly, her nose. Kia, she cried. Naruto no Eki. How am I a pervert for pointing that out? The laughter that came next felt even better than before, it was as if a weight had been taken from his shoulders. It felt good to be safe, after fighting all those titans down there. He'd been more than careful, after giving Eren to Mikasa and the others in his titan form, he'd said nothing, given no indication of who he was. It was simply too risky. There would already be an uproar once everyone learned of Eren's secret, and he had no desire to add to that chaos. So like Annie, he'd disappeared into the city seeking a safe place to rip himself out of the folds of his neck in relative solitude. He knew she was around somewhere, just as he knew she wouldn't want to be disturbed. Least of all by him. She'd just betrayed her ideals, however briefly, to rescue him back in the square, forfeiting the priority of her mission to save his life. Change wasn't an easy thing, it never was. It could be awful, painful, sometimes even dreadful, as he'd come to realize himself. And sometimes it could be wonderful. Annie would have to learn that on her own. Yes, he couldn't show her that, it was one of the few things she would have to learn the hard way. He'd used Sage Mode to determine her whereabouts before she was somewhere up here, somewhere atop these walls with their comrades, radiating sadness and sorrow, taking great pains to avoid him. No matter. He would let her come to him when the time was right. Speaking of right. Oi, Jean. His apprentice stiffened, suddenly aware that his master was no longer distracted by his fellow disciples. He grew even more stiff when Naruto rose and walked past and sat down beside him, ignoring the sniveling Daz, who had yet to pipe down about his incessant fear of the Titans. Buffoon. Didn't he understand what was happening here? What he was doing? His irrepressible fear was slowly but surely eating away at their resolve, at the strength of those who had survived, of his students. Yes, morale was high here because Naruto had come to their rescue, but everywhere else there had been high casualties. Didn't Daz realize this? If he didn't shut his yap soon, there was going to be a panic. Why yes, sensei. Jean gulped, mistaking the murderous intent in his master's eyes for himself. I wanted to ask you about. I don't want to fight the Titans anymore. Daz's sudden scream earned a start from both shinobi, drawing the blonde's ire. Kurama seemed to agree, too. Noisy little shit. TCH. Naruto frowned in agreement. As I was saying, have you seen? It's over. Daz was still wailing. We're going to die. We're all. Yakamashi. Naruto struck down mercilessly at the recruit's head, driving Daz's face into the ground with such force that his body actually bounced from the motion. The sheer force of the strike sent him skidding across the ground for several meters, his limbs pinwheeling wildly, tumbling end over end before finally rolling to a halt at the edge of the upper wall. Marco barely managed to catch him in time before he sailed out into the abyss, before he plummeted down towards the eager titans below. Oi! The boy exclaimed. What was that for, sensei? If he's going to bitch, then he can do it somewhere else. Naruto snarled, slamming his fist into the table. I'm sick of cowards like him. At least my students didn't falter. They stood strong while buffoon like him were bawling their eyes out. They kept up the fight even when everyone else was devoured around them. Had he been paying more attention to his surroundings and said students, he might have noticed, of all those present, Jean, Mina, Sasha, even Krista, flushed with pride. Those were the first words of congratulation he'd ever spoken aloud since the day of graduation. And he'd said them now here before the eyes of the public. There's just something about that. Sensei's being a little rough today, isn't he? Krista murmured to Sasha. The brunette sighed and pushed a hand through her hair. She could understand Naruto's anger. She herself had nearly frozen up in the supply depot. If it weren't for his training, she might have ended up Titan food. Thank Kami for ninjutsu and her earth affinity. When she'd failed her strike from the rafters and her blade had glanced across the shoulder instead of the neck, she'd nearly panicked. But then her training had kicked in. She'd successfully buried the 3-meter under a landslide of mud before it could even react, affording her just enough time to slice its neck. To the awe of her fellow classmates. That had been her first kill, she'd held herself together and everything had come out all right. Naruto had taught her that. Always keep cool under pressure. Rely on your own strength, and if that failed you, rely on yours truly, he'd said. But who did Naruto rely upon? Sasha could tell, he was shouldering the burden of leadership, shouldering all those deaths himself so that others wouldn't have to accept the burden of responsibility. He'd been so many things to her in the last 3 years, teacher, friend, obstacle, goal, but who had ever been something to him? I'm very grateful for all that you taught me. Sasha blinked at that, the memory coming back to her as she walked away from Krista, begging a half-hearted excuse. Why had she embraced him back then? At the time, the answer had seemed obvious. She'd been convinced that her sensei was about to die. But that was a lie, wasn't it? She'd known he wouldn't die. Naruto was too strong for that. But then Mikasa had kissed him. So had Mina. And yet she hadn't been able to even him or whisper soft words to him or do anything like Mikasa or Mina had. She didn't have the nerve, so she'd settled for a fierce embrace instead, unable to bring herself to do what she truly wanted. That Mikasa. I won't let her get a head start on me. Where's Mikasa and Armin? Naruto was questioning Jean as she approached, Marco having finally relieved him of that noisemaker. Didn't they make it up the wall with you? Jean blanched. They did, but. Ah, I see. Naruto nodded. A gag order, huh? Why am I not surprised? The brass would definitely do something like that in this situation. Let's see now. Where are? He inclined his head, eyes dusting with golden hue. That was Senin mode. They're over that way, then. Great. They're all in one place. It makes things easier for me, then. Pulling a scroll forth from his pocket, he effortlessly garbed himself in a Spar Army uniform and cloak almost before Sasha could blink. He looked absolutely stunning in those cloak, the very picture of perfection as he walked away. But Naruto wasn't perfect, no, he was the furthest thing from it. He could be harsh, stubborn, foolish, even downright rash at times. And yet at others he could be impossibly kind. He didn't like to see others suffer, so he tried to shoulder everything at once, so that he might suffer instead of them. Was he still suffering now, she wondered. Back there, he'd promised he would save everyone. But, he hadn't been able to keep his word in the end. So many had died, only 20 out of 50 had actually made it up the wall. Perhaps that was why he'd put Jean in charge at the end. Because he felt he hadn't lived up to his promise. It was only then that Sasha realized she was still holding the loaf of bread and no one else was making any moves to follow Naruto. Chance. She bolted after him, long legs chewing up the distance between them, until Jean and the others were nothing but a memory. Naruto noticed her at the last instant, his head turning a fraction of an inch to regard her approach. He didn't have to look down, nearly her as much as he once had to meet her gaze. These last 3 years had given her more than just strength and skill. Sasha was taller now than the others, nearly as tall as him. The thought brought a small, secret smile to her face. Did you need something, Browse? Naruto didn't even break his stride as he spoke, it was up to her to force him to stop. You seemed a little tense back there. I wonder about that. His grim facade didn't soften in the slightest, nor did his brisk pace slacken. Was there something else? His message was clear. I don't want to talk about that. End of discussion. Sasha carefully ignored the warning signs and his body language, waited until they reached one of the few tents lining the walls. Then she moved. It wasn't a graceful trick by any means. She simply increased her pace a little until she got ahead of him. And then she stuck her foot out. The effect wasn't as disastrous as she'd thought it would be. The toe of Naruto's boot caught on her ankle, but instead of planting his face into the ground, he stopped halfway and grabbed her by the arms, whipping her against the wall with enough force to crater the stone. Sasha silently thanked his training. That impact would have shattered the spine of a non-shinobi. As it were, Sasha felt only the faintest tingle in her back. She'd have a bad bruise tomorrow, but nothing more. Browse, the hell? He glared at her, his eyes furious and crimson. What are you doing? Sensei, here. Eyes downcast, Sasha lowered her head and thrust out her wrists, interposing the bread between his face and hers. It worked like a charm. Naruto froze, his anger frozen dead in its tracks. Apparently the significance of her gesture was not lost on him. Sasha never shared her food. Ever. He glanced at her, down at the bread, then back to her, his hard eyes softening, if only marginally, as he realized her intent. He took her by the wrist and pulled her closer, bringing the bread up to his face. To her disbelief, Naruto didn't take it out from her hand. Quite the opposite. He ate it right out of her palm, his teeth sinking into the still warm bread and slowly pulling a chunk of it out, grazing her fingers as he pulled away. Despite her best efforts, Sasha felt herself flush. She knew he possessed untold strength, and yet there was something incredibly gentle about the way he'd done that, his eyes flicking up at her as he did so, that sent her heart fluttering, hammering against her chest like the drums of a great hunt, out for her blood. Ironic, considering she and her pa had once been hunters before she'd come inside the walls. Life is precious. Treasure it while you can. Who knew what might happen after this? She might die in the coming counterattack, or worse, Sensei might die. Sasha knew firsthand just how powerful Naruto was. She'd once seen him get hit by a cannonball and get back up again, only muttering a half-hearted, ouch to himself. Yes, he hadn't been hurt at all. But Mina had already told her an awful truth. Naruto had nearly died in a titan's stomach only hours before. She might see him as strong, nearly invincible, but her teacher was all too mortal. If he were to die. Shit. Naruto said suddenly. You're crying. I didn't hurt you back there, did I? Huh. Sasha blinked, alarmed to find a single tear rolling down her cheek. I was. Before she could think to brush the droplet aside, he reached forward, snatching it up with his finger. "'Tis nothin'." The words came out without pause or preamble, revealing her country accent. Ah. Sasha gasped, realizing her mistake. I mean. Oh. His smile sent her blood boiling, in a good way. So that's how you really sound, eh? Why didn't you tell me about it before? It's kinda cute. Sasha didn't know why she kissed him, only that she did. It was as if someone had hijacked her body. The moment she heard that word, she was no longer in control of herself. One moment Naruto had her pressed against the wall with one hand, using the other to brush her tear away. The next, Sasha pivoted into him, shoving the bread into her back pocket, reversing their position. Naruto blinked, baffled by this flying act of thievery, but before he could speak, Sasha and her mouth met him in a frenzied rush, her tongue licking at his lips, silently asking for entry. Yes. Sasha didn't know why she'd kissed him. Why she was still kissing him, when she knew there was a huge chance, that he'd only push her away. There was no way he could possibly care about someone so plain as her, so why hadn't she stopped? I know I can be an idot at times, but this is too much. Why can't I just let go of him? There was just something about Uzumaki Naruto, something that drew her in, held her down, prevented her from even trying to think. She'd first felt it during her training when he'd taught her how to run. Not as she'd run before, but to truly run, with every fiber of her being. Using these things he called the 8 gates. She'd dismissed it as folly before, until he'd taught her. What a backlash. She hadn't been able to walk for nearly a month after opening just 3. Yes, Naruto had taught her all that and more. And yet now she was facing the distinct possibility of losing him, once and for all. Down, Sasha. She didn't want to think about those times anymore at all. She wanted to make a memory with him now, however tenuous it might be, before it was too late. And it already was too late. She could feel him beginning to respond to her now at long last, his mouth moving against hers, hand slipping from her face, moving to the still subtle curve of her shoulder, then her waist, looping round her to draw her in close. The heat of his body burned against her uniform like a furnace, forcing her legs to drift open. Mind if I cut in? Sasha froze, the sound of that voice sent chills shooting up and down her spine. Everything seemed to lurch beneath her, sending her mind into freefall. A deep sense of vertigo grabbed her, as if she were being dropped from a great height. And then it stopped. Her eyes fluttered open, her hands reached out for Naruto and found him gone. All that remained was the lingering scent of him, hanging against her nose, her skin still tingling from where he'd touched her. It served as a subtle reminder that he had been and still was quite present, wherever she was, here in this never-ending blackness. Where was she? What was this place? Turn, mortal. A deep, dark voice commanded her from behind. So that I might see you with my own eyes. Reluctantly, Sasha did so. Fear, awe, confusion, all these thoughts paled in comparison to the monstrosity looming before her. A fox. Sasha was staring at the king of all foxes, quite possibly the largest animal she'd ever seen. Easily larger than a mountain, its entire body bore a gleaming coat of crimson fur, 9 tails of pure scarlet laying lackadaisically behind it. Ruby red eyes bored into her, slitted pupils observed her every movement. At last, just when Sasha Browse thought she would go mad with fear, it spoke. Hello, Sasha, it grinned, exposing row upon row of razor-sharp teeth, easily larger than her entire body. It's so nice to finally meet you face to face. Something about the way he said niece made Sasha shiver in genuine fear. Whomever this being was, he most certainly wasn't nice. Who are you? The great fox pretended to consider her question for a moment. I have been called many things. But for now, I suppose you may call me Kurama-sama. I reside within the boy you find yourself so verily smitten for. As do you, at the moment. You mean, I'm inside Naruto-sensei. Sasha felt her face heat through a million shades of scarlet. If her mind was here, then what the devil was her body doing out there? Surely she wasn't, oh dear Kami. Inside the seal that contains me, Kurama corrected with a bemused growl, so more or less your consciousness is inside his stomach. And as for your body, how should I explain it? He tapped a claw to his forehead. I suppose you could say the time flow here is distorted. Every minute that passes here only amounts to a singe second in the outside world. I only transferred a portion of yourself to the seal to speak with me, but my partner is bound to realize something's up sooner rather than later, so I suggest you make up your mind. I don't know whether to feel proud or insulted. I strongly suggest the former. A low growl grated across Sasha's ears. Too late she realized she'd crossed a line. The brat doesn't let just anyone set foot in this place, only those he holds near and dear to his heart have ever entered here. If you wish it, I can always send you on your way and make you forget this ever happened. No, Sasha pleaded. Wait, strange as it might seem, this could be her one and only chance to learn about her mentor. Oh, the demon fox arched an eyebrow. Having second thoughts. Sasha resolutely ignored the subtle jibe. What can you tell me about Naruto-sensei? Do you know where he's from? What about his favorite ford? Or silence. Kurama thrust a claw to her forehead, getting just that. If you want to know that badly, then I'll just show you. But I should warn you, he doesn't take kindly to others poking around in mind like this. He nearly killed the last one who did this. If your motives are less than pure. I want to see. Very well. Sasha instantly regretted that decision. Memories flowed into her mind like a river, one she couldn't afford to dam even if wanted to. Countless scenes of battle and bloodshed. Trials and tribulations. Friends who became enemies. Of loves lived and lost. Life and death dealt like the wind, always unexpected and inopportune. Just when she thought she couldn't handle any more, she was granted a glimpse of one last image. At the center of it all, a lonely little boy sitting on a swing, his fists clenched tight, his soul screaming with loneliness. Why won't anyone accept me? Gah! Sasha recoiled, clutching at her head, reeling from the sheer pain that accompanied the image. It had all felt surreal. You truly are resilient, mortal, the fox mused, pausing to scratch at its head. You probably got a bit of Akamichi blood in you somewhere. It would explain your appetite. Is there more? Much more. Kurama snorted. But that's not why you're here. It's not. No, he replied. I've summoned you to this place to give you a warning. And a gift. Sure you have. More and more Sasha Browse felt her normally cheery demeanor beginning to slip. Having endured the deaths of her comrades was one thing, to deal with an insane, perverted fox was another. Now in the haze of Naruto's memories still clogging her mind, she'd become almost despondent. How could one person endure so much suffering and still remain so kind-hearted? So pure. Throughout it all, that had been more than a constant, in all his years he'd remained, and would continue to remain, an unrelenting force for good. It seems my host has taken an interest in you. Kurama continued, ignoring her deadpans. Among others. They do not interest me. What does interest me is thus, who will be the one to succeed him? 8 of you there are, and yet I sense that one of you will die before today is done. That makes 7. My host is not yet aware of this fact, so I thought I should take precautions to make sure you don't lose your life in the next few hours. You don't exactly strike me as the cautious type. 8. Sasha wasn't listening, she was still reeling at the kitsune's implication. It didn't make any sense. Naruto had only trained 7. Why, you're lying. Sensei doesn't keep secrets. Am I now? Kurama replied, sneering in the face of her confusion. Well, it doesn't matter if you believe me or not about my host's secret student, but I'll give you his name anyway. Marco Bot. Didn't you know? He's the only one amongst you who actually knows Senjutsu. I suppose Naruto finally recognized his own mortality last year and decided to start training a successor. Regardless of that fact, one of you will be dead before the sun sets. It may be you. It may be Marco. It might even be that Gene boy. I don't know, little mortal. Personally, I think it would be troublesome to have any of you die. You and the others are one of the few things that keep him from losing his mind. But even I cannot alter fate. I can only influence it. Now, stretch out your hand and make a fist. Sasha did so without hesitation, resolutely extending her hand and clenching her fingers. Now what? This. Kurama met her small fist with his own, his giant knuckles pressing against her hand. Sasha felt something shift in her stomach, then there was only pain. Once more she thanked Naruto for his intensive trainings, she was able to endure the agony with only a soft hiss escaping her lips as the fire seared through her veins. It was as if a fire had been lit somewhere deep within her belly, slowly spreading to the rest of her body with an excruciating slowness. Somehow, she managed to rasp out a question. What the? I've lent you a fourth of my chakra. Kurama told her, lips parting to reveal teeth set back in a snarl. Now in a way, you're like that Ackerman wench. Minus the filthy Uchiha blood, of course. I don't care how diluted it might be, just the smell of her makes me sick. It may burn now, but you'll thank me later if you get in a tight spot. Tongues of white-hot fury licked across every inch of her. Even as he spoke, she could see the red chakra emanating from her stomach to scrawl out across her skin in a strange sort of cloak. Oh God. It was really starting to hurt now. Oh wow 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 wow. You should be grateful, mortal. She could barely hear the beast's words over the pain. It's not often I waste my own energy on peons such as you. And then it was over, the chakra receded into the pit of her stomach in a rush, leaving Sasha sore, but still standing. Ow, she snarled, glaring at him. You piece of bold, little one. Kurama commended her courageous fortitude with a grunt. You come from a strong bloodline. Your chakra coils are many times more resilient than the others, stronger, even, I think, than that wench who holds the last of the Uchiha blood. I see now why you were taught you to use the 8 gates. To think, he's already attracted 3 others like you. 4. She knew Mikasa and Mina counted, as well as herself, but who else was there? That crazy Hanji bitch doesn't count. To her mild amusement, the fox actually shuddered. Honestly, I don't know if she wants to dissect Naruto or rape him. I've never met a more frightening human in all my life. Not since Madara. Anyo, who is this Hanji-san? Sasha asked, her curiosity piqued despite the dismay she felt. She vaguely recalled hearing that name as part of the Recon Corps. The most evil woman alive. Kurama whimpered. Don't believe anything she says. It's all lies, I tell you. Lies. I see. Sasha was feeling more than a little strange by now, her vision was beginning to blur, and her head now felt as if someone had taken a titan-sized hammer to it. It was probably best if she left here, before her sensei realized just where she was. That's why I've taken such an interest in you. The nine-tailed fox leaned forward, its snout now mere inches away from hers. You were one of the closest things this world had to a shinobi before that blonde idiot activated your coils. You were a hunter when you were younger, were you not? But I digress. This form must frighten you. Allow me to assume a more tolerable shape. Crimson light swirled about the kitsune as it drew back, its fur and snout slowly receding, claws assuming the shape of fingers, paws receding into the shape of open-toed sandals. Sasha stepped back as the shadows coalesced around him, watching in awe as his body shrank and assumed human proportions in the blink of an eye. Now that he'd finally, Sasha found herself staring at a darker version of Naruto. His hair was still blonde but longer, more matted around the edges, whisker marks that had once tripled his cheeks were now rough gouges on either side of his face. When he looked at her, smiled at her, she could see his sharp teeth and she knew that although this might look like Naruto, this was not Naruto. The brunette struggled to remember that but to no avail, her mind might know that this wasn't Naruto, but her body didn't. Besides, she was already lost in those deep crimson orbs. Better. Kurama asked with Naruto's voice. Cripes. He even sounded like him. A little. Naruto no. Kurama looked her up and down, a thoughtful smirk pulling at the corners of his feral face. Interesting. What are you smiling at? Oh, nothing. The demon shook its head. You see, it's been so long since I took human form. And as such, I find myself in a certain mood. As a matter of fact, I've just thought of a wonderful way for you to repay me for my little gift, earlier. He pinioned her with his gaze, rendering her body insensate with a single glance. Then he started forward, one step at a time, slowly closing the gap between them. Wait, what was he doing? Were he seriously trying to? No. Oh sweet God, no. He wouldn't dare. Oh, but he would, and now she was powerless to retreat, all Sasha's training was stripped away beneath his gaze as though she'd never had any to begin with. When she tried to call upon her chakra, none came. Wait, stop. Sasha pleaded. What are you doing? Claiming my reward, of course. Kurama replied. Besides, he reached out and grabbed her by the arm, drawing her close to him, nudging her chin to meet his. If that idiot wants to indulge in a little pleasure, where's the harm in doing it myself? But you can't. She struggled to reason with him. You're not Naruto. Aren't I? We practically share the same soul now, the boy and I. His grip was like a vice around her waist now, drawing her body into his, forcing her terrified eyes to meet his bemused gaze. All those secret thoughts he daren't let surface, all those desires he never acts upon, manifested in me. Stop it. His lips were close to hers now, perilously close. It's almost as if. What the hell are you doing, Baka Kitsune? Sasha startled out of Kurama's arms as Naruto's voice exploded into life behind her, punctuated by gale force winds strong enough to shatter the darkness surrounding them. She whirled in a panic, flabbergasted to find him standing only yards away, his face frozen in a rictus of furious anger. Couldn't wait, could ya, kid? Kurama chortled roughly, his true voice echoing in the empty open space. And here I was just about to have a little fun on your behalf. Naruto said nothing, he simply continued to stare at his darker half. Now's not the time for this, Kurama, he said at last. On the contrary, the fox disagreed. Now's the perfect time. To ensure your legacy, that is. Naruto bristled. What did you do? Kurama laughed. Why don't you ask the wench? Naruto didn't ask her. Instead he cocked his head, as though listening to a voice in his head. Abruptly, he rounded on her. A low growl left his lips. Sasha. The brunette gulped despite herself, suddenly nervous in the wake of his gaze. Naruto, I can explain. Out, he hissed at her. Now. A small gasp fled from her lips as something jerked her backwards and out of the seal. When next she opened her eyes, she found herself back in the outside world. Naruto, glaring bloody red daggers at her, found herself being held at arm's length. His eyes were wide and disbelieving, his features rough, sharp, and absolutely furious. Why were his eyes crimson? Sasha had never seen him this angry before. Come to think of it, she'd never seen him angry before. At all. Ever. The closest she'd come to seeing him angry was when she'd occasionally stolen his food during mess hall, and even that paled in comparison to this. Sensei, I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to do what? Like an iron trap, Naruto's gaze locked onto Sasha's own. The sheer intensity of his stare, the sudden ice in his expression, was enough to silence her, nay, the entire camp. Nothing moved. Nothing at all. And then he spoke, voice black as pitch, eyes cold as the coldest winter. I have spent, he began softly, 3 years training you, Sasha. Teaching you. Breaking you down and rebuilding you from the ground up. Making you strong, stronger than you've ever been. And not once have I pried into your past, not once have I asked any questions you'd find uncomfortable, and not once have I gone skulking behind your back, poking around in your brain and doing things that shouldn't be done. The sage's voice had been rising with each syllable, now he was practically shouting at her, red in the face, practically choking on the words. You went inside my mind. I'd expected the same courtesy from my favorite disciple. His words caught the ear of everyone nearby. Sasha was suddenly aware of everyone staring at her. She was only thankful that Theed left Jean and the others behind. This dot was so embarrassing. But not nearly so much as being caught with her hand in the cookie jar, both literally and figuratively. Favorite. The brunette flinched back and aside, stung by his words, and yet at the same time, oddly vindicated. His favorite. She'd always assumed Mikasa was Naruto's #1 pupil. Her grades certainly indicated as much, but now that she thought about it, he'd spent the least amount of time with Mikasa. She'd been a natural, taking to chakra like a duck to water. Sasha, on the other hand, had not. Naruto had been forced to drill both her body and mind until she caught up to the others. He'd often said that she reminded him of himself when he was young, having to work through so much to become the masterful sage he was now. More than once he'd also compared her to someone named Rock Lee, noting that she made up for her faults through sheer persistence. This time, that persistence had backfired. Horrifically. I was your favorite. She asked Naruto, her words little more than the most naked of whispers. Was being the operative term. Venom dripped in his words, caustic enough to peel rust off a blade. Not anymore, not after that stunt you just pulled. He drew back from her with a hiss. You know what? Leave. I don't care where you go, or what you do, just get away from me. His head jerked away from her in disgust. I can't even bear to look at you right now. But, you what? Naruto all but growled. You'd better have a damned good excuse for poking around in my head like that, browse. I just wanted to know more about you. Now it was Naruto's turn to jerk back. He did so as though she'd slapped him across the face, eyes wide. He hadn't been expecting that answer. You, what? He rasped. I wanted to know about you. Sasha could feel the tears coming now, and she didn't even try to stop them. They were pouring out of her eyes faster than she could hope to dry them, flowing into her mouth, rendering her words watery and weak. Your likes, your dislikes. Where you came from. What you want to be. How you came to save us when you could have saved everyone else. Why you feel you have to shoulder everything and take all the blame, all the responsibility, even when it's not your fault. I didn't want you to deal with it all alone. Is that so wrong? She could feel herself slipping back into her old accent again, but by now she was angry, far too angry to care. Is it so wrong that someone as plain and stupid and simple as me actually cares enough about ya to risk pissing ya off? God, I'm so stupid. All I ever do is burden ya for crying out MMPH. Her eyes bulged as Naruto's lips collided with hers, stealing her words away. It wasn't a rough kiss by any mean, his mouth simply caged hers, stifling all sound. His palms cupped her cheeks with an infinite tenderness, cradling her face as though it were made of the finest china. You are not, he whispered, pulling away, a burden. Sasha was baffled. How could Naruto-sensei go from being furious to kissing her speechless? You, what? Sorry, he apologized, his words sorrowed and contrite. That was rash of me. I shouldn't have shouted at you. He gazed at her for a long moment and to her infinite relief, nodded. You really are too honest to lie, aren't you, Sasha? If you were worried about me, you should have just said so. There was no need for you go inside my head. You saw something ugly, something I wanted to keep hidden. Up in my memories. He turned aside and she could see the anger twisting at his normally placid face, warping his features into a livid mask of rage not directed at her but elsewhere. I fucking hate when people screw with my head. Even if they claim it's for a good reason. So, abruptly, his gaze snapped back towards her. Was it for a good reason? Were you really willing to risk death me for me by taking on that much chakra? Sasha couldn't help it, she blanched. You knew about that, huh? I know Kurama has his reasons for doing whatever he does. Naruto replied, laying his hand upon her stomach, fingertips digging into the taut flesh beneath. Doesn't mean I have to agree with them. Now I have to make sure he didn't fuck up your chakra coils. This might burn a bit. Turned out he was right. Sasha felt her face begin to burn all over again. She didn't care if Naruto was looking at her chakra coils or not. This was still supremely awkward. A thread of warmth from her stomach and spooled down between her legs in an instant, leaving her weak-kneed and woozy. Was this actually turning her on? If he kept this up, if she would. Sensei. Naruto purred back at her. Stop that right now. Sheesh, you really are honest. Naruto's laugh tore through her haze of pleasure like a thief in the night. Naughty, Sasha. Naughty. Do I have to punish you for thinking such things? He took his hand away from her stomach and brought it towards her inner thigh, curling her leg up against him. As swiftly as his smile had come, so too did it vanish, shattering like so much glass. He cocked his head aside at her, his blue eyes flashing in the setting sun as he took his hand away and stood to his full height. When he spoke this time, his words were serious and somber. So now you know my dirty little secret. I've got a monster inside me. And you should also know why I'd prefer to keep that under wraps. He turned his gaze down to the recruits below. I've already learned my lesson the hard way. If I were ever to unleash my full power inside the walls, everyone would die. Not just the Titans. Not just the people. Everyone. Everything. I transformed briefly 3 years ago and I nearly scared everyone half to death. If I'd had my way, no one would know about the truth of what I am. But now that you've gone and stuck your nose where it doesn't belong, and here he did flick her with his finger, I suppose I'll have to trust you with that secret. That secret. Unbidden, her midden flashed back to that mysterious Titan she'd seen, running away from them and into the city. You mean there's. Naruto laughed at her, it was a deep throaty sound. Really, do you think I'm going to tell you after the emotional hangover you just gave me? You're persistent, Sasha. But then again, he leaned forwards, mussing her hair with a hand. That's what makes you who you are. You can't change that any more than you can keep the sun from setting. And you shouldn't try. Without another word, he was gone and past her, striding away as though their little heart-to-heart had never been a consequence at all. When he paused, she was momentarily taken aback. Oi, Sasha, hold the rest of that bread for me until I get back. Hey, you were right about one thing. He was suddenly in front of her again, leaning in, lips brushing against hers for all of an instant. I'm fucking starving. Whatever else her sensei might have said was cut off by the sharp discharge of a cannon. Naruto turned as he once more felt the faint tingle in the back of his brain, the sign of a Hiraishin Kanai being activated. He spun away from her with a delighted cackle, leaving her cheeks alight in 7 shades of scarlet. Guess that's my cue. A golden flash was the only indication of movement, then Naruto was gone, off to wreak havoc and defy fate as only he could. It was only then that Sasha realized something. In all the confusion and their heated argument. She hadn't thought to give him Kurama's warning. Moments earlier. I'm human. I see. Kit's vermin murmured to himself, his terrified gaze never once leaving that of Eren Jiger's. Don't resent me for this, brat. It's only natural. No one can prove that you're not a demon. Slowly, he raised his arm, fingers pressed into a single point. He took no pleasure in their grief-stricken faces, but in the end, his fear won out. They had to be killed. They had to be. Now. This very instant. There was just no way that this whelp could be an ally. Not at all. He had to die. Without thinking, he slashed his arm downward. Fire. There was a deafening bang, punctuated by a wet popping sound, a sulfuric scent reaching everyone's nose as it discharged its payload. Eren watched, helpless, poised between biting his thumb and screaming in horror as the massive iron ball hurtled towards him and his friends. Out of the corner of his eye he could see Mikasa reaching for what looked like a kunai, her fingers wrapping around its sealed hilt. There came a faint sucking sound, then. Belay that order. Suddenly and without warning, an angel came down from heaven. There could be no other word for that blazing blonde blur, its figure sheathed in golden radiance, its eyes burning like hot coals in its skull. It seemed to hang there in the sky for a moment, invisible wings holding it aloft on streamers of golden light. Then the angel did the inexplicable, the unthinkable, thrusting itself firmly between the three cadets and the approaching shot with arms splayed, intercepting the cannonball and shattering it. Eren saw it all in that instant. Their savior raised a hand and bit down. Hard. Blood spurted and took solid form. Something massive grew around them in recompense for his temerity, and the cannonball simply broke against its palm. It flew apart into 1,000 different pieces, spraying shards of debris in every direction, some of which struck the pig-headed instructor who'd ordered them to fire on him in the first place, knocking him from his perch in a shower of bloods. Karma at its finest. Grunts of pain and screams of untold agonies echoed through the cloud of rust and rotten dust. He didn't need to see to know that panic must be unfolding beyond his line of sight. "The things I do for you kids," a gruff voice hissed. Mikasa gasped in confusion. Eren sympathized. In the silence that followed, Jaeger found himself staring at the wings of freedom emblazoned upon a cloak, the bright white-blue emblem of the Survey Corps proudly standing between him and certain death. But what was a member of the Corps doing here? It didn't make any sense. They'd all gone out on an expedition just this morning. There was no way they could have returned in such a short time. He peered up into the smoke to no avail, unable to make out the face of his rescuer in the haze created by the cannonball's explosion. "Do not lose your composure, Eren Jaeger," that same voice continued, speaking to him, and him alone. "Do not break your stance, stretch out your awareness, don't let your guard down for even a single second. And take that hand away from your mouth before you do something foolish. These imbeciles are ready to kill you at even the slightest provocation, and I'd rather not any more of my students die today." "Sensei." Mikasa blinked, trying to peer into the haze. It was then that Eren realized something else. This so-called angel, this man mistaken for divinity, wasn't an angel at all. He knew him, recognized him. Although this man had not taught him the shinobi arts, he'd been responsible for beating the brutal art of hand-to-hand combat into him for the last 3 years all the same. As if on cue, the smoke began to dissipate, revealing the figure of the one standing over him. Eyes the color of blue diamond peered down at him, past him, through him, staring into his very soul. "Naruto. No, Kurosaki Ichigo." They snapped back. "Who do you think I am?" Faced with the blonde's sarcasm, Jaeger faltered. "I don't even know who that is." "Godamnit shit." The blonde was complaining now, waving his still steaming hand about for the three of them to see. "That really hurt, ya no? Seriously. Coulda blown my arm off back there if I wasn't careful. Jaeger, the least you can do is apologize to my poor hand for putting it in this damned situation." Even as Naruto spoke, Eren could see the massive construct sheathing his limb. It was as if a giant hand had sprouted forth from nothingness to protect them, and he was waving the damned thing around as though it were some kind of toy. "Naruto, what is..." "Oh, Mikasa." Their teacher turned, as though just seeing her. "Thanks for activating the kunai back there. I might not have made it in time otherwise." "No, I don't think that's the problem here." Mikasa pointed, his eyes wide. "Your hand." Naruto followed his student's gaze, watched flesh knitting back together on his fingers, muscle and skin growling over the skeletal hand that he'd sprouted to defend them. Within seconds, the massive hand was entirely untouched, as though it had always been. "Ah," he groaned in understanding. "Shit. Did I do that? Damn, first Sasha, and now this. I just can't seem to keep a lid on things today." "Don't worry about that, Mikasa-chan." With a grunt, he pulled his hand free of the monstrous limb. "Since the cat's already out of the bag, guess I'ma have to say it. I'm like Eren. Like Eren, a shifter." Naruto said it as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Eren gawped at him as if he'd grown another head, to which the blonde simply sighed. Well, I had been hoping to avoid telling everyone about my little secret, but thanks to your little stunt back there, he turned his gaze back to the rapidly fading fog and the figures standing beyond. I don't think that's possible anymore. Deprived of what strength it needed, the artificial limb began to collapse around them in great gouts of steam, kicking up still more dust and debris. Now I sincerely hope the three of you have some sort of plan to get out of this with your skin intact, because I've got absolutely nothing. Armin. Me. You mean you haven't put that brilliant brain of yours to work yet? Naruto questioned. I was expecting more out my most brilliant student. I'm not that. Of course you are. A frickin' genius. Armin started in surprise as his mentor jerked forward, thrusting his face before him. Don't you remember? You mastered the basics of chakra in a day. It took everyone else a week. Even Mikasa didn't learn that quickly. You may not be the most resilient, but you learned the most jutsu as well. You're not a burden. Your friends think the same. Stop underestimating yourself. Armin knelt there, the words soaking in. Not a burden. TCH. Looks like I've got no choice now. Naruto sighed. Armin, I'll buy you some time. Come up with a plan before I get shot, will ya? Without another word, he strode forward, making his way out of the smoke. Armin watched him go, watched his sensei stride to the death. Had he been doubting himself all along? Was it all in his head? If so, was he really handicapping himself? He glanced at Mikasa and Eren, saw the resolve there in their eyes. It was all in my head. They never thought of me like that at all. Naruto knew none of these thoughts. He kept walking, slowing only when a shape from the smoke resolved beside him. I'm coming with you. Mikasa's voice, then her figure, resolved beside him. There was a hard glint to her eyes, one Naruto recognized all too well. Remind you of someone. Urasai. I'm not talking to you after that stunt you pulled with Sasha. It worked, didn't? Was the Kistune's counter. You finally opened up to someone. Stubborn, he muttered to Kurama, as much as Mikasa, quietly pushing a palm against his forehead. I'm doing this for your sake as much as Eren's. Besides, shouldn't you be more worried about him anyway? He's your brother after all, and the only one you have left at that. I'm just someone who happened to teach you a few things. Unbidden, his mind flashed back to their kiss back in the rooftop. What the hell is with these kids, they're so damn willful. Yes, you're just my sensei. The Blackett replied blandly to his statement. Nothing can change that. Good. Glad you see things my way. Her hand lashed out, snaring him by the wrist and grinding him to a halt. N. But I only have one of you, too, she finished with a raise of her gaze, dark eyes boring into his. Clashing with his. And I know it's selfish of me to say this, but I don't want to lose you either. Slowly, she wrapped her hand around his, pushing her fingertips between his own. Is that so wrong, sensei? Naruto growled, a hiss snaking through his clenched teeth, a muscle jumping in his jaw. You stubborn, willful little. I'm coming, she repeated, the slightest of smirks pulling at her lips. She knew she'd already won. Can you really afford to waste time trying to stop me? God's girl, you remind me of Sasuke way too much. TCH, do what you will. He stormed forward into the haze, leaving her to follow. The dust and debris parted for him, giving way to his furious pace. Vermin was there waiting for them as they departed the choking haze. His already pallid complexion became positively gray once he laid eyes upon the seething sage. Stop! He cried. Naruto didn't stop. He continued his relentless advance, his long legs eating up the distance between them. Sweating bullets, the captain ordered his men to raise their rifles. Stop or I'll shoot. Finally, the blonde slowed to a halt, a mere 3 yards away. Uzumaki, what is the meaning of this? I could ask you the same question, vermin. There could be no mistaking the deliberate insult in the blonde's tone. Where do you get off firing on my students like that? Silence. The slimy little man backpedaled in the face of Naruto's malevolence. You have no authority here. He was beginning to panic now. The shrapnel had inflicted more than its fair share of wounds upon him, his metal state left hanging by a mere thread. His left eye was already beginning to swell up, and his sword arm was bleeding from a nasty gash that would surely become infected if not treated forthwith. Did the last sage care? He did not. I have every authority, Naruto replied, his words growing colder still as he reached for a blade. I may serve with the scouting legion, but my orders come from the monarchy. If I see someone at fault, I may correct them. And you, my good sir, are most certainly at fault. You fired on 3 trainers without so much as hearing their side of the story. I could court-martial you for that. No, I could kill you right now and no one would bat so much as an eyelash. Slowly, almost casually, he pulled his sword free, and in an instant, laid its edge upon Vermin's bleeding arm. Is that what you want? Ackerman. Realizing his own peril, Vermin rounded on the rookie instead. What does your boyfriend have to do with this? BB boyfriend. Mikasa felt her cheeks begin to burn. Of all the times to bring this up. He's my sensei, sir. Lies. Vermin shrieked. We have witnesses. You were seen kissing him atop the roof of the bell tower. Relationships between ranking officers and cadets are forbidden. Explain yourself. Mikasa opened her mouth to deny it, to refuse the truth, only to find herself silenced by a finger to the lips. Mikasa, Naruto smiled serenely down at her. What did I teach you about dogs? That got a blink from his pupil. That the weakest ones always bark the loudest. Naruto nodded sagely. Very good. And as you know, sometimes, some dogs need a muzzle. Vermin's single eye went wide as his right arm was severed from his body, the limb now falling away from him in a flash. The fingers were wriggling slightly as the nerve endings within them struggled to receive signal from his brain once more, dropping the sword that they once held as his hand groped on blindly. He lunged backwards, his left arm stretched out in a vain attempt to staunch the blood flow. Yarg! The man tried to scream, tried to grab and wield his fallen blade. Uzumaki Naruto buzzed into view, his body blocking the man's weapon, his eyes glaring out coldly from behind a veil of golden light. With a hiss, he swung his arm backwards, a streak of golden light rocketing out from the tip of his fingers and incinerating both the captain's arm and his sword within the bright energy. He didn't even give the man time to retaliate, his boots barreled forward and drove the buffoon back a dozen paces in the blink of an eye, increasing the distance between them. Now then, Naruto sheathed his bloody blade with a sigh. Unless you'd like to lose your other arm, I suggest you refrain from such audacious accusations and return to the matter at hand. Silence. I will not tolerate this insubordination. The blonde shrugged. Then I'll just take your other arm, then. Wait. Stop. Naruto turned his head aside, regarding the boy's sudden emersion from the steam behind him. Good boy, he mused softly to himself. He's finally come up with something. It's a shame, though. Another second and I've been rid of this buffoon for good. Eren isn't the enemy of mankind. Armin declared. We're willing to share all the intelligence we've gathered. Begging for your lives is useless now. He revealed his true from in front of us. There's nothing left to say. If you say he's not an enemy, prove it. If you can't do that, I will eliminate the threat. So, Naruto thought, he thinks that was Eren back there, not me. And he's still driven by fear despite losing his arm. Interesting. I might not have to do anything after all. There's no need for further proof. Armin barked. It's unnecessary. The issue isn't how we see him. What? Armin risked a glance at his teacher, and received Naruto had done nothing to interrupt him so far. Sensei trusted him. He could do this. You said everybody saw him. He continued, plowing on in the face of adversity. Then they must have seen him fighting those titans too. And they must have seen all the titans ganging up on him. Don't you understand it now? They see him as prey, just like the rest of mankind. Nothing you say can change that fact. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the ranks, soldiers lowered their blades, pulled their fingers from the triggers of their rifles. That's true. A titan is an ally. That can't be. For a moment, just a moment, Armin hoped that they'd see reason here. It didn't last. Prepare to attack. Vermin screeched. Don't fall for this clever trap. Their actions have always been beyond our comprehension. If they can transform into humans and speak our language, that's just another way for them to fool us. We can't let them do as they please. No good. He's stopped thinking entirely. No. He's too scared to think. He risked a glance back at Eren and Mikasa, and his courage returned. I have to do this. Almost before he knew what he was doing, Armin had slammed a fist into his chest, standing tall and proud despite his trembling knees. As a soldier, I swore to devote my heart to the resurrection of mankind. There is no greater glory than dying for that belief. If we added his titan power to the might of our armies, it might even be possible to recapture the town. For the glory of the human race of our race, I beg you. In my final moments before I die, permit me to explain his strategic importance. There was a silence. And then, to everyone's horror, Vermin began to raise his hand. This was it. He was going to fire on them again. That was a good try, Armin. Arlette startled as a hand settled upon his shoulder, momentarily alarmed to find Naruto scowling on the man ahead of them. But I'm afraid it didn't work. See, the poor fool's gone and lost his feeble little mind. Taking his hand from his student's arm, he started forward, his expression unreadable, his eyes hidden in those rough blonde bangs. He's too scared to think anymore. So it'd be better if I showed him, the power you're talking about. For real this time. Sensei. Oi, scum. Naruto called up at Kit's Vermin. You wanted proof that Eren's on your side, right? Well then. Watch this. Sighing, Naruto raised a hand to his face, bit down on his thumb. Hard. Mikasa and Armin braced themselves as best they could against the flash of life. But there could be no bracing against the monster that strode forth from that flash. It was as if Naruto's human form was just a shell, as flimsy and fragile as a caterpillar's cocoon. And the creature that emerged from this chrysalis, the result of this metamorphosis, could only be described in a single words. With its great towering height and six-arm, long blonde hair, scarlet eyes and armored arms, a maw bristling with razor-sharp teeth. Yes, there was only one word to describe this Asura-like entity. Monster. Screams of horror and dismay rose up from those assembled, nearly deafening Eren and the others. Witnessing a partial transformation was one thing, but to see a full-blown titan standing there before them in all of its malevolent might, was another thing entirely. Soldiers scrambled backwards as Naruto towered over them, his jaws creaking opening before an exhalation of syncytial steam. Armin felt his heart sink into his stomach. No way. Naruto, what? Mikasa gawped up at the towering titan. And yet, she felt no fear. There was only awe. She remembered it now, this was the same titan who had handed Eren to them back in the square. The aberrant who hadn't attacked them. This then, was Naruto. Unbelievable. Yeah, it's me, he growled, lowering his head to look her in the eye. Sorry for deceiving you back there. Are you afraid? The Blackette gazed back at him and asked herself that very same question. Did this big beast frighten her? No, she knew this was Naruto, just as she knew Naruto would never lay a hand on his disciples. She shook her head slowly, raven tresses bobbing from the motion. Stifling her anxiety, she stepped forward, placing a hand upon Naruto's massive ankle. His skin was searing to the touch, severe in its heat, and yet she felt nothing but comfort. No, she said softly. I'm not afraid of you. As expected from a descendant of the Uchiha, the titan chortled softly, turning to face the cowering Vermin. You really do have ice in your veins. Mikasa had no idea what an Uchiha was, but she chose to take that as a compliment. This the power that Eren and I possess. Naruto bellowed, his words crashing down around them like thunder. The power that can seal the breach and reclaim the town. Shoot me, if you must, but if you do, it won't end well for any of you. Beside him, Ian paused. If it was true, if Naruto Dono really could control this titan. Captain, we should consider Silence. If Vermin had been beyond reason before, then he was practically frantic now, staring up into those sinister scarlet orbs. Staring into the eyes of a titan pushed him past his breaking point. Prepare to fire all rounds at once on my signal. His arm rose and fell in what felt like slow motion, his eyes wide and fearful as Naruto surged forward to intercept the incoming cannon fire. No matter how they plead for their lives, they're still rebels. Traitors. I bet those other two are titans as well. Yes, they must be. That makes them the enemy. Those who threaten the safety of mankind must be killed without hesitation. They must be eliminated. That's what it means to be a soldier. His arm snapped down. Cut it out already. All eyes turned to find Vermin restrained, and hand holding him at the elbow, preventing his arm from dropping any further. The one responsible was an aged, unassuming man in uniform, his only distinguishing feature being the red sash worn around said uniform and his deep hazel eyes. His mustache quirked in a slight smile as he held Vermin back. Every man, woman and child knew this man, commander of the Southern Territories and esteemed general by far. You haven't changed at all. The elderly fellow continued. As big as you are, you've still got the guts of a scared fawn. Vermin gasped. Commander Pixis. And there, standing beside him, impossibly, was Annie. So that's where she was. Armin realized, unmoving. Sensei, did you have this planned out all along? No, that can't be right. He wouldn't risk our lives like that, would he? He risked a glance back at Naruto's Titan form. His fellow blonde appeared smug, but there could no mistaking the brief uncertainty that flickered through his eyes. That settled it then. His master was just as baffled by Pixis's arrival and Annie's presence as he. Did he too know just how lucky they were? Can't you see how magnificent his salute is? Pixis said as he strode forward toward Armin, heedless of Naruto's Titan standing only yards away. I just arrived, but the situation has already been relayed to me by this young lady over here, he indicated Annie with a nod. You go organize the reinforcements. I think it'd be worthwhile to hear what they've got to say. But that wasn't a question, Captain. Pixis's tone was kind, but it left no room for further argument. Dismissed. Vermin slinked off, tail between his legs. To his credit, the commander waited until the coward was well out of earshot before finally clearing his throat. Uzumaki Naruto, I presume. Pixis continued, addressing the giant. Naruto nodded. Would you mind stepping out of that body for a moment? Pixis asked. I'm afraid you're frightening my troops back there. Unless you have any objections. Naruto's Titan did something impossibly human just then, crossing all 6 arms before its chest. What guarantee do I have that you won't open fire anyway? It spoke. One of the soldiers gasped. I'm a he, not an it, thank you very much. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Don't compare me to the rest of those Titans. As I've already said before, I have control of this form. Now, he turned his towering form back to the commander, answer my question. What's to stop your boys from trying to kill me the moment I step out of this body? As things stand, I think it's rather obvious they'd sooner see me dead. Surely you can understand that we are both men of principle here. Pixis sighed as he pulled a flask from his coat pocket and took a long hard draught. I've absolutely no intention of causing you or your students any harm here. I certainly don't plan on opening fire like that buffoon Vermin did. And as you can see, I'm rather fond of my arms. So no, I don't think I'll be harming you or Jaeger-kun over there anytime soon. You should do something about cowards in your ranks. Annie seconded icily. Agreed, my dear. Pixis smiled at Annie as he replaced the flask within his coat pocket. By all means, your teacher is free to mete out whatever discipline he may deem necessary, but please, don't kill the man. Dead soldiers are bad for morale, you understand. Now, would you kindly come out of there, Uzumaki-kun? Sure. The nape of his neck began to bulge and writhe as the man within fought for emergence. Soldiers squirmed restlessly as an arm appeared, followed by a leg, pursued by a torso. Slowly, but surely, Naruto's human form wrested itself free of the Titan's flesh, inch by painful inch. He hadn't been kidding when he'd said it was a bitch to re-emerge. On his own, it took at least a few minutes, time in which he was left vulnerable to enemy fire and grasping hands. Then with a sickening squelching sound, Uzumaki Naruto burst from the back in a shower of gore. He alighted soundlessly between Eren and Mikasa, shaking himself like a wet dog. Gah, he grumbled, I really hate that part. Pixis arched an eyebrow at the sight. Interesting. Jaeger can do the same. Naruto replied, dusting himself off. Although he probably doesn't have the same level of control as me. So you can control it. Naruto turned his head to regard she who had spoken, one Riko Brzezinska. The silver-haired girl was peering at him intently, as though she expected him to snap and eat her at any moment. It was almost laughable, to a fault. Ever since he'd met her on the wall 3 years before he'd been made aware, known of her fear for all things Titan. Then again, those fears were all too understandable. He needed to remind individuals like her that he meant them no harm, needed to remind these soldiers that he was on their side, before someone did something stupid and got everyone killed. He could feel Annie's gaze boring into his back. If he was going to reveal that she Stu was a Titan shifter, no was the time. Even now, her crystalline eyes were silently pleading with him for silence. Idiot. Kurama groused sullenly. You're gonna shoulder everything again, aren't you? Naruto mentally sighed, agreeing with his partner for what felt like the first time in a century. Yes, he was an idiot. Without a second thought, he readily affirmed. I'm the only other shifter within the walls, though. Annie's soft gasp barely reached his ears. Oh. Pixis smiled strangely at this remark, unknowing of the crisis that had just been averted. Well then, if your level of control is as high as you claim, perhaps you and Jaeger-kun can assist me with a plan I've been formulating. These students of yours might have a pivotal role to play as well, he said as his gaze glided to Mikasa and Armin. I believe there were 8 of them, correct? Naruto frowned. He didn't like where this was going. Not at all. The commander was suggesting that he endanger the lives of his precious disciples for a second time, and for what? Naruto had no way of knowing. How could that sit well with him? And what plan might that be? He asked guardedly. Pixis's smile was practically beatific. Why, to reclaim trust, of course. There was a silence. Finally, Naruto sighed. Got anything to drink? He asked at length. Pixis offered him his flask. The blonde gladly accepted it from the man's hands and took a long, deep draught. Burning liquid coursed down his throat and warmed his belly, lending him just a touch of solace. Naruto had the succinct feeling he'd be needing a drink or two before this day was done. Gasping, he proffered it back to the commander. Strong stuff, he choked out. I only drink the best. Pixis offered him a slight smile. Quote. Naruto sighed as he followed. We're in for one wild night. Annie was waiting for him after their strategy session atop the wall, her cold eyes seeking his the minute she realized he was alone. A plan had been made, though she herself questioned the validity of it. Not because it was Armin's plan, not because it was foolish she'd suffered far worse, but because everyone was relying on Naruto and Eren to make it happen. If those two failed, then not only would Trost be lost, but so too would Walrose. She didn't need her shadow clone to know that. There could no doubt about that this time. And she couldn't risk revealing herself a second time just to help them. She just couldn't. So she stood there in the shadows, silent as a goddess, watching, waiting until Naruto finally finished his meeting with Pixis and came down from the wall. Even now he continued to baffle her. He didn't bother to use his maneuver gear, he simply walked right down the wall as though it were the easiest thing in the world. Fearful gasps greeted his little publicity stunt, sending Annie's temper skyrocketing. This was why humanity needed to die. They'd become rotten to the core, so filled with fear and avarice that they no longer knew how to think for themselves. Kit's vermin was merely one such human. His insane paranoia had nearly ended Eren's life before it could truly begin, and the coordinate with him. Had it not been for Naruto's intervention, she'd never have reached Pixis in time. How do you do it, Naruto? How did he throw himself headlong into impossible situations and still emerge the victor? How did he fight with such ferocity, for so little? More importantly, how had he managed to worm his way into her heart? Annie hated that more than anything. She'd long since locked tight the door to her heart and thrown away the key. But Naruto, he'd barreled right through it. That iron door meant to keep everything locked out and away in this fragile thing that was her Saihei. And because of that, she'd nearly been exposed for what she. Why do you do it, Naruto? Why did he waste his efforts on those who weren't worthy of them? Why defend them when all but a handful spat in his face? It didn't make any sense. These fools would sooner hang him than help him. Yet he simply carried on, ignoring their suspicion. Even now, he finished striding down the wall, resolutely uncaring for all the eyes glued upon him. Some made no secret of their jealousy, they longed to learn his secrets so they too might escape the Titans as he and his students had. Others, a precious few, gazed upon him with the open awe and respect he deserved. They did not fear him, nay, they all but worshipped him. Men and women of age and children who were not this group seemed intent to make his praises known. Naruto-sama, one of them cried. We're so glad you're all right. Echoed another. Please destroy the Titans for us. Still a third cried. Naruto said nothing, neither to them nor to her as he passed by. Because he didn't have to. He probably already knew what she was going to say. But that didn't mean she couldn't try. And so Annie fell into step beside her sensei, matching him stride for stride. He barely even glanced at her. They walked like that for a little while side by side, mingling amongst the troops, observing their despondent faces and mournful wanderings. She tried to ignore them, Annie really did, but there were just so many. It was as if everyone had been drained of their very hopes and dreams, all that remained were withered, despondent husks. It's almost sad, isn't it? Naruto's voice jerked her out of her reverie. They've all succumbed to their fear. You're an idiot, she said at last, but her words lacked rancor. It's not your job to defend cowards. They kept walking, leaving the terrified soldiers and cadets in the dust. And still, Naruto didn't slow his pace. Annie began to wonder where he was taking her, even thought to ask her fellow blonde. Still, they kept walking until at long last, they reached a line of trees. Beyond them lay the territory of Walsina, likely to become Titan territory if Walrose fell today. Naruto pulled up beside a tree and uttered a nameless earth jutsu. Doden. The ground itself rose up behind him, forming an impromptu bench beside them. Her teacher promptly took a seat and leaned back to regard her, arms crossed before his chest. So I'm an idiot now, huh? His lips quirked in a slight smile. And what, pray tell, did I do this time? You could have exposed me back there, but you didn't. Annie felt a muscle jump in her jaw as she claimed a place beside him, but she refused to drop the subject. She had to know if was just screwing around or not. He must have some greater plan for her in store, else he surely would have said something to Pixis. Why? She demanded to know, leaning. Are you so sadistic that you want to keep me under your thumb? Use me as your own little slave until I've got nothing left. Or maybe. You're thinking too much, Annie. His words brought her up short. Huh, I don't want to manipulate you. Naruto stared back at her, eyes shining like a sapphire sea. I don't even want to use you. And why should I? You're my precious disciple after all. You came to save me when I needed it, not just against the Titans, but with pixies as well. He leaned back against the bench, regarding the ever-sinking sun below the horizon. If you hadn't come when you did, I would have taken my chances, eaten vermin, and scaled the wall on my own. That's twice I owe you now. Keeping silent is merely one way of repaying that dual debt. So technically, you still owe me. His gaze turned wary. I suppose so, yes. Annie held her breath for a moment, considering. Daring to hoe against hope. This was her chance. If Naruto owed her, if he was the sword to repay his debts. Then help me. That got a reaction. Help me kidnap Aren. I refuse. But why? She hissed, disbelieving. If I possess the coordinate, then the attacks will surely stop. And what guarantee do you have that they will? His response was flinty, his gaze dominating. I already know the armored titan and the colossal titan are posing as humans just like you. I may not know their current objective, but make no mistake, I will find them. The only question is when. It doesn't matter what I owe you, that's one request I won't grant. Then, come away with me. With a great effort, Annie reined her rapidly thawing heart in. These people don't care about you, none of them do. You're wasting your talents here. Can't do that either. Naruto shook his head. I'm needed here no matter what you say, no matter how much everyone might hate me, so long as my actions make a difference in the life of one individual, and so long as that individual grows up to live a life unfilled with fear, that's all that matters. And I've already made a difference in some lives, nothing you say can change that. Besides, where would I go? In case you've hit your head or something, it's Titan country out there. My village would be safe, they'd accept you. After treading on the bodies of countless innocents to leave. I don't think so. You, insufferable baka. Annie jerked to her feet, her face burning. What's wrong with you? Can't you see that I'm trying to help you here? Yeah, I'm an idiot all right. Naruto jumped up right after her, shoving his face against hers, shouting right back at her. An incredible idiot. An incredibly stupid idiot who took his worst enemy under his wing and taught her what it means to be human, that's what I am. Someone who spent the last 3 years of his life, who will continue to spend the rest of his life, making damn sure she doesn't fuck up hers because of some damn stupid mission given to her by some damn stupid father who doesn't know his ass from his. Slap. Naruto's voice cut off in mid-sentence, his head snapping backwards with the force of the blow. Annie glared at him, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. Don't you ever talk about my father that way. And what are you going to do about it, huh? Her teacher hissed. It doesn't change the fact that he's a heartless prick for. Annie's arm reared back to smack him again, but she underestimated his speed. Naruto had by the wrist before she knew it. Even as she thought to strike him with the other, he seized that limb, too. She was suddenly grateful for the distance between them and the wall. This would have been horrifically embarrassing, were anyone to see. Annie bucked, tangling her legs with his, yanking him forward, dragging him to the ground. Naruto choked in surprise as they went down together, he holding her wrists, and she kicking at him with all her might. Soon enough they were rolling around on the ground, each seeking the advantage over the other. I hate you. Annie railed at him. I hate you too, he shouted. I hate you. Oh, yeah. Well, I hate you more. Bastard. Bitch. Insolent man. Troublesome woman. I really want to kiss you right now. Ditto. Naruto wasn't quite sure who initiated the kiss, only that someone did. Somehow, his lips pressed against hers. Lips a world apart from his own, softer, somehow. He couldn't bring the words to bear. Her delighted gasp snaked through his ears like smoke roiling through honey, further piquing his desire. Her tongue rolled against his with the repressed passion of an eternity. Incredibly, he found himself pulling away, only for her hands to lock around his head and draw him back in, smashing his mouth to hers in furious desire. No, the world was a hiss. No, you fucking don't. You don't get to back out now. Firm fingers twined through his hair, tickling over his scalp, tormenting him. What was it about her that drove him crazy so? He was pretty sure it had something to do with the old saying. Opposites attract. If she was ice, then he was fire, determined to thaw her. There was just something about her cold demeanor that drove him to distraction, or in this case furious argumentative passion. It was exactly what he needed after losing so many students to the Titans. Just a form of release. Looks like you found an outlet for all that frustration after all. Kurama mused. Naruto's smile grew another inch at the thought, his gaze shifting to the blonde beneath him. I hate you, she growled anew between kisses. So freaking much. Love you too, Annie. Naruto laughed, his mirth muffled by her mouth. His actions earned him an angry hiss. Love this. Her body smashed against his on a moan, another reminder of torment and desire, and he fought back a shudder. Too long. It had been too long since he'd experienced this, since he'd yearned to feel again. Unthinking, his hand closed around her jacket, intent on tearing it free from her body. Wait, she hissed, her teeth sinking into his lower lip. Wait. Naruto froze, his entire body rigid. I'm calling in that favor you owe me, her eyes bored into his with unspoken need. You. Me. Here. Now. For the next hour. Here. Was she serious? Even if one were to assume Pixis would wait that long, that was an absurdly long time. Now, Naruto was no stranger to intimacy, having already lost his to a certain Mizukage during his time, but the sheer audacity of Annie's demand actually left him a little taken aback. Now, her eyes told him she wouldn't take no for an answer. Unless, you don't think I'm good enough. Another challenge, fire against ice, daring the former to yield. Naruto had no words for that, he couldn't have found them even if he tried. Instead, he nodded. Then he rose. Annie barely had time to gasp before he yanked her up into his lap, forcing her body to rise with his. Then he drew back, receding further and further into the trees. He carried her as though she weighed no more than a child. A few paces later, and he lowered her just as gently, bringing her down to the floor, hands cupping at her cheeks and holding her fast, kissing, kissing, kissing. How much longer are you going to tease me, bastard? She whispered in between a kiss, shrugging at her garments. Do I have to take these off myself, hey? Rip. A hand flashed out like greased lightning, rending her shirt to rags in an instant and knocking her down. In an instant Naruto was there, forcing her down, mouth smothering an exposed breast, nipping with sharp teeth. The moan that fled from Annie's lips was like fire in his veins. A hand dipped down, closing around the edge of her pants, but gently. Rather than ripping them away as her had her jacket, his fingers proved deft, taking hold of the undergarments within, finding her nether lips to plunge deep into sensitive bundle of nerves beyond. Then followed his mouth, drawing a startled yelp from her. Better. He grinned, raising his head. Kiss me up here, you asshole. Annie hissed, her voice leaden with desire. Naruto hesitated at that, hanging over her like an ancient god. Though Annie panted and mewled beneath him, she never turned from him or tried to shove him away. Though glazed, her gaze remained firmly fixed with his. On occasion she would wander to see the scars on his bare chest and forearms. Though she seemed fascinated by them, she never once asked how he'd acquired them. Nostalgia warmed his eyes, reminding him of the very first woman who had seen these scars, gazed upon them with wonderment, and said nothing. Annie did not ask him now either, nor did she press him. A lone tear trickled down his right eye to land upon her cheek. Why are you crying? She asked, staring at him in disbelief. Naruto had never cried since she'd met him. Never. It's nothing. Naruto laughed bitterly. Just an old memory. The ice in her eyes softened for a moment, her lips moving almost inaudibly. Quote. What? I said, let's make a new one, then, she replied softly, arching up beneath him to push her lips to his. Naruto froze. Not once had he ever considered being intimate with anyone ever again. Not like this. He'd always thought himself too jaded after he'd lost May in the war. Until this very moment he'd thought Annie must have been messing with him, pulling his leg. Being her usual cold, callous, demanding self. Now he realized she actually wanted him, truly, shared his sentiment, because he felt the grip on his wrist slacken, slide, until her fingers were intertwining with his. The realization brought him more joy than he'd ever thought he could feel. All right. He bent to kiss her again, and was reminded once more of the strange bond they shared. Not that of a master and student, but of something else. One of pain. Each knew what it was like to face adversity and emerge victorious out of that fire, forged into something strong and unbreakable. They each had cracks in their armor, weaknesses that the other loved to exploit. There was none of that now. None of that at all, as her tongue tangled with his, inflaming his desire to an almost feverish degree. Thoughts of Mikasa and Sasha and Mina flickered through his mind. Lord Almighty, this wouldn't be fun to explain to any of them, but his passion pushed such thoughts down, leaving him only eyes for the young woman beneath him. A thought flickered in the back of his mind, surfacing as the young woman beneath him wriggled her way out of her pants, exposing Krem's smooth skin, and long legs that seemed to go on for miles. Only. Oh, bugger. I love you. Annie gasped out, suddenly startling both of them. Naruto stared at her for a long moment, mouth agape, utterly disbelieving in what he had just heard. Never once had he thought to hear such words again, certainly not from her mouth. Kurama shared in his disbelief. What did you just say? To his infinite disbelief and delight, the blonde beneath him burned brighter than a volcano. I'm not going to say it again, idiot. She sputtered, struggling to reclaim some of her pride. In that instant, Naruto was all but unable to take his eyes off of her. Annie. He drew a deep breath, swallowed, exhaled. He'd said these words before to her in mockery, now he had to wonder, did he actually mean them? He knew the answer, already. He felt the same. Just as he felt for all his students, just as he felt for Mina, Mikasa, Sasha. Yes. Of course, he realized with an epiphany. I love you too. He lowered his lips to hers again before she could speak, and for the next hour, their world consisted only of the two of them. In those sinful 60 minutes, everything just fell away. Naruto frowned at Eren's Titan form. It was behaving strangely. Instead of lifting the boulder as had been the plan, it was just standing there, gazing off into empty space, uncaring even as countless soldiers began to perish around them. Sasha and the others, his precious shinobi students, were out there buying time for Eren to lift the boulder while the task of personally protecting him fell to Naruto's Titan form. And all because he himself didn't want any part of the glory. He was beginning to regret that decision. TCH. At this rate he'd have to do it himself. Striding forward, he reached out with one of his 6 arms, seeking to jostle the smaller Titan by the shoulder. Oi, Jaeger, he growled. Get your head out of her ass. We need to move. No response. Naruto shook him again, roughly this time. Eren. That got a response. The Titan turned to face him, green eyes narrow. A low growl left his lips, causing the blonde to stiffen. What in the world? Dodge. Perhaps it was his confusion, or maybe the misguided belief that Eren wouldn't dare attack him for fear of what he'd seen earlier. Regardless, Naruto found himself unprepared as the rogue Titan lurched to its feet, eyes little more than slits in the back of its head, hands clenched into fists. Oh! Clenched knuckles barreled into his unprotected face. Hard.